"Your farm is so big," Ethan said quietly. His saddlebag already packed his horse waiting at the gate, and Clara Whitfield felt everything she'd fought for suddenly balanced on the edge of one man's next breath. 2 years alone. 2 years of cut fences, stolen cattle, and Victor Hale circling her land like a wolf waiting for her to collapse. She had survived all of it. But watching this cowboy prepare to leave the only person who had ever stood beside her without being asked something broke loose inside her chest. She whispered, "Then stay, and take care of it." He turned. "And me too." If this story is already pulling at your heart, subscribe to the channel and follow every twist until the very end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning Ethan Walker rode onto Rose Creek Ranch, he wasn't looking for trouble. He wasn't looking for anything, really. That was the honest truth of it. After 6 years of drifting from one job to the next, mending other men's fences, driving other men's cattle, sleeping under other men's roofs, Ethan had stopped expecting anything from a new job except a cot, a meal, and enough pay to move on when the season ended. He'd learned the hard way that wanting more than that only set a man up for the kind of loss that didn't heal clean. He'd heard about Rose Creek Ranch from a cattle broker named Patterson in Billings, a heavy-set man with ink-stained fingers and a habit of talking with his mouth full. Patterson had leaned across his desk, lowered his voice like he was sharing a secret, and said, "Widow woman out near the Judith River. Big spread. Lost her husband 2 years back, and she's trying to hold it together herself. She needs experienced hands, not greenhorns. You interested?" Ethan had asked how big. Patterson had laughed. "Too big for a woman alone. That's for damn sure." Ethan hadn't said anything to that. He just picked up his hat, nodded once, and told Patterson to send word that he was coming. He rode in from the south on a gray Tuesday morning, and the first thing that hit him was the sheer scale of the place. He'd worked on big ranches before, outfits that ran 200-300 head, but Rose Creek was something different. The land stretched wide in every direction, rolling grassland that reached all the way to the tree line along the river, and even from a distance he could count dozens of cattle spread across the northern pasture. There was a main house, solid and well-built, with a long covered porch. Behind it, a barn, a bunkhouse, a smokehouse, a tool shed, a chicken coop. Farther out, he could see the remains of a fence line that had been cut and never properly repaired. He was still taking it in when the front door of the main house opened, and a woman walked out onto the porch. She wasn't what he'd expected. He didn't know exactly what he had expected, something more fragile, maybe, or more desperate, but Clara Whitfield was neither. She was younger than he'd imagined, probably no older than 30, with dark hair pulled back from a face that was tanned and serious. She wore a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow and carried a ledger book under one arm, like it was as natural as carrying a rifle. She looked at him the way a woman looks at a horse she's considering buying, measuring careful, not committing to anything yet. "You're the man Patterson sent," she said, not a question. "Ethan Walker." "Yes, ma'am." "You've worked cattle before?" 15 years. "You've managed hands?" "When I needed to." She studied him a moment longer. "I've got 4 men right now. 2 of them are good workers. 1 of them I'm not sure about yet. The 4th one..." She paused. "I let him go last week. I need someone who knows what they're doing and doesn't need to be told twice. I'm running this ranch, and I don't have time to babysit grown men who think a woman can't give orders." Ethan looked at her steadily. "I follow orders from whoever signs my pay." Something shifted slightly in her expression, not quite softening, but some of the wariness easing back a fraction. "Then we'll try it," she said. "Bunkhouse is out back. Talk to Miguel, he'll show you where things are. Be ready to work at first light." She turned and went back inside without waiting for a response. Ethan stood there a moment, looking at the door she'd closed behind her, then looked out again across the wide land. He felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, something he couldn't quite name. He didn't try to name it. He picked up his saddlebag and walked around to the bunkhouse. Miguel Reyes was a compact, sun-darkened man in his 40s, with a thick mustache and the steady eyes of someone who had seen enough not to be surprised by much anymore. He showed Ethan around without fuss, pointed out the cot at the far end of the bunkhouse, told him where the water barrel was, and then sat down on an overturned crate and looked at him directly. "How much did Patterson tell you?" Miguel asked. "Said the widow needed experienced help, that the ranch was big." Miguel made a short sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "He tell you about Hale?" Ethan shook his head. Miguel was quiet for a moment, pulling at a loose thread on his sleeve. "Victor Hale owns the Broken Spur operation about 12 miles northeast of here. He's been wanting this land for 2 years. Since before Mr. Whitfield died, if you ask me, though. I can't prove that." He looked up. "He's made 3 offers since the funeral. She's turned every one down. After the last one, things started happening." "What kind of things?" "Fences cut. 3 times now in the same section of the north pasture. Cattle gone missing, not in big numbers, just enough to hurt. Last month, someone diverted a section of the creek that feeds the south tank. Took us 4 days to find it and fix it." Miguel paused. "Nothing you can prove in a courtroom, but it's not coincidence." Ethan sat down on the edge of his cot and listened. "Mrs. Whitfield knows it's Hale," Miguel continued. "She's smart, smarter than most men want to give her credit for. But she's also one woman managing a ranch this size, and she's been doing it for 2 years without enough hands and without enough capital because her husband's debts didn't die with him. She's holding on by sheer will, but—" He shook his head slowly. "Will only carries a person so far." Ethan nodded. He understood that more personally than he intended to let on. "Why are you still here?" he asked. "If it's getting dangerous." Miguel looked at him like the question surprised him. "Because she's my employer and she's treated me fairly for 6 years. Because this is a good ranch and she's a good woman." He stood up and picked up his hat. "And because somebody ought to." He walked out. Ethan sat alone in the bunkhouse for a long moment, listening to the wind move across the land outside, and thought about all the ranches he'd passed through in 6 years, without ever once asking himself that question. The first week, Ethan kept his head down and his eyes open. He repaired the damaged section of fence in the north pasture, not just patching it the quick way, but pulling the old posts and resetting them properly, the way you did when you intended the repair to last. He checked the water sources, mapped the cattle rotation in his head, and watched the 4 hands work. Miguel, he trusted immediately. A young man named Danny, barely 19, but tireless, had good instincts and better hands. The other 2 brothers, named Cole and Roy Buford, were adequate workers, who watched him sideways when they thought he wasn't looking, and talked to each other in low voices that stopped when Clara walked past. On the 4th day, Ethan told Clara what he thought. She was in the barn going over the ledger when he came in, and she looked up without putting the book down. "The Bufords," he said. Her jaw tightened slightly. "What about them? I can't prove anything yet, but I want to watch them." "You think they're reporting to someone?" "I think it's possible." She held his gaze for a moment. He expected her to push back to tell him he'd only been there 4 days and didn't know enough yet to make that call. Instead, she said, "I've thought the same thing for 3 weeks, but I can't let them go without something solid. If Hale finds out I'm accusing his people without proof, he'll use it against me." Ethan nodded. "Then we watch." "Then we watch," she agreed. She went back to her ledger. He almost left and then didn't. "Mrs. Whitfield." She looked up again. "Patterson told me your husband built this place." Something moved across her face, brief and controlled, like a door opening and closing very fast. "He did. 12 years. Started with 160 acres and a small cabin." "It shows," Ethan said, "in the way it's built, in the care that went into it." She looked at him carefully, like she was trying to figure out what he was after. Then she seemed to decide he wasn't after anything, and just nodded once. "Thank you, Mr. Walker." He walked back out into the afternoon. Behind him, he heard her pen moving again across the ledger page. The first big moment came on a Thursday, 12 days after Ethan arrived. He was riding the eastern fence line with Danny when Danny pulled up his horse and pointed toward a gully about a quarter-mile off. "Something's not right," Danny said. Ethan had already seen it. 3 of their cattle, a cow, and 2 young steers, were moving away from the gully, being pushed by a man on horseback who was working fast and low, trying to stay out of sight of the main ranch house. Ethan didn't say anything. He kicked his horse into a run. The man on horseback heard him coming and bolted, abandoning the cattle and heading for the tree line to the north. Ethan pressed hard for 200 yards before pulling up. The tree line was thick and dark, and he didn't know the terrain well enough to ride into it blind. He let the man go. He turned the stolen cattle back toward the east pasture and rode back to find Danny. "Did you see his face?" Ethan asked. Danny shook his head. "No, but I saw his horse." He paused. It was wearing a broken spur brand. Ethan sat with that for a moment. "Don't say that to anyone yet, not even Miguel." Danny looked confused. "Why not?" "Because information is only useful if the right people have it at the right time." He rode back to the ranch house and found Clara in the yard. He told her what happened plainly and without embellishment. He watched her face as he described it, the tightening around her eyes, the slight flare of her nostrils, the way her hands went still at her sides. "A broken spur horse," she said quietly. "That's what Danny says." "Danny's a reliable observer." "Yes." She was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Hale's going to deny it. He'll say the horse was stolen, or that the rider wasn't one of his, or that we're mistaken. And without proof we can take into a courtroom, it's just our word against his." "I know," Ethan said. "Then what do we do with it?" "We file it away. We keep collecting. And we wait for him to make a mistake big enough that there's no explaining it." Clara looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Then she said, "You've dealt with men like this before." It wasn't a question, but he answered it anyway. "Once," he said. "It didn't go the way I wanted. But I learned a few things." She held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary, then looked away toward the horizon. "All right," she said. "We wait." Bulb. It was around that time that Ethan started noticing small things about Clara Whitfield that the outline of Widow Managing a Difficult Ranch didn't cover. She was up before anyone else every morning. Not just a few minutes before an hour, sometimes more. He would come out of the bunkhouse in the gray pre-dawn and see the light already burning in the kitchen, and if he walked past the window, he might catch a glimpse of her at the table with her ledgers spread out, her coffee going cold at her elbow, working through the numbers with the focused intensity of someone trying to solve a problem that kept changing shape. She knew the land with an intimacy that surprised him. Not just the basic geography, she knew which sections of the north pasture went soft after a heavy rain, which water sources ran slow in late summer, which stands of grass came in fastest in spring, and could carry more cattle than the average man would assume. Thomas Whitfield had built this ranch, but Clara had spent 12 years learning it alongside him, and what she'd absorbed had become her own. She was also, he discovered, a considerable reader. One evening he came back to the barn late and found her sitting on a hay bale with a lantern and a thick book, some kind of legal text, he realized when he got close enough to see the spine. She didn't look up when he came in. "Water rights," she said before he could ask. "I've been going through the territorial statutes. There's a provision in the homestead law regarding continuous use of water sources that I think applies to our situation. If Hale tries to file a claim on the Northern Creek—" She stopped, looked up at him, like she'd suddenly realized she was talking to the hired help about legal strategy. "Sorry," she said. "You probably don't need to hear all this." "No," Ethan said. "Keep going." She studied him. "You know anything about water law?" "I know a little about land law in general. I worked as a survey assistant for 2 years before—" He stopped. "Before I went back to cattle work. I know how the territorial claim system works." Clara closed the book slowly, still watching him. "You've had an unusual career, Mr. Walker." "Most people's lives are unusual if you look at them close enough," he said. She almost smiled at that, almost. "Sit down," she said. "Let me show you what I've found." He sat down on the hay bale next to her close enough to see the pages she was pointing to, and for the next hour they went through the statutes together while the lantern burned low and the horses shifted quietly in their stalls. She was sharp, quicker than he'd expected at following the legal logic, asking exactly the right questions, connecting provisions he hadn't thought to connect. He found himself leaning in to point at a passage, and then becoming aware of how close they were, and he straightened up and focused on the page. When they finished, she closed the book and sat back. "If he does come at us through the water rights," she said, "we have a case." "We might have a case," Ethan corrected carefully. "It depends on the documentation, how much of the ranch's history is recorded." "Enough," she said. "Thomas kept meticulous records. And there are people in this valley who've known this land for 40 years, she paused. "People Hale hasn't been able to buy yet." Ethan nodded. He stood up. "Good night, Mrs. Whitfield." "Clara," she said. He stopped. "If we're going to be working through legal strategy together, you might as well call me Clara." He turned back. Something in him wanted to keep the distance, wanted to keep this exactly what it was. A job, a temporary arrangement, nothing more. He knew where letting the distance close could lead. He knew the weight of it. "Good night, Clara," he said. He walked back to the bunkhouse, and he didn't sleep well for a long time. Cole Buford broke first, and he broke in the worst possible way. It was late on a Friday evening 3 weeks after Ethan's arrival, and most of the hands had ridden into town for the weekend. Ethan had stayed behind. He'd told Miguel he wanted to check on a heifer that had been looking rough, which was true, but it wasn't the only reason. He'd been watching the Bufords all week, and something felt wrong about the way Cole had been moving around the perimeter of the property. He was coming back from the south barn when he saw the light in the main house window where there shouldn't have been one. Not a lantern light. Something more like a candle, moving room to room, carried by someone who wasn't Clara. He moved fast and quiet. He came through the side door and followed the light to Thomas Whitfield's study. A room Clara kept locked, he'd noticed, and where she stored all the ranch records going back to the founding. The door was open. Cole Buford was inside with a candle going through a cabinet of documents. "Cole." Cole spun around so fast, he knocked the candle sideways. He grabbed it before it fell and pressed himself back against the cabinet, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. "I was just—" Cole started. "Don't," Ethan said. Cole's jaw went tight. He was a bigger man than Ethan, broader across the shoulders, and he made a calculation that Ethan could see happening in his eyes, a brief calculation about whether to try something physical. Then he looked at Ethan's face and apparently decided against it. "What are you after?" Ethan asked. Silence. "Cole, I'm asking you once. What are you looking for?" Cole set his jaw. "You can't prove anything. I can prove you were in a locked room going through private documents. That's enough to get you arrested, and that's enough for Mrs. Whitfield to press charges." Ethan kept his voice level. "But you know what I actually think you're worried about. I think you're worried about what Hale does to people who get caught and can't be useful anymore." Something changed in Cole's face. Fear Ethan recognized. Genuine fear. I'm not working for Hale," Cole said, but his voice had lost its edge. "Your brother is." A long, awful silence. "Where are the documents you already took?" Ethan asked. Cole pulled a folded envelope from his jacket pocket without being asked twice. His hands were shaking slightly. Ethan took it, checked the contents without opening it, a stack of papers. The top one bearing the Rose Creek Ranch letterhead, and looked back at Cole. "Get your things," Ethan said. "You and Roy both. You'll be gone before morning. If you set foot on this property again, or if Hale gets one more piece of information that could have come from you, I'll make sure you both answer for everything that's happened on this land. Do you understand me?" Cole understood him. He was gone by midnight. Roy with him. Ethan sat in the study for a long time after they left, looking at the cabinet full of documents and thinking about everything those papers represented. 12 years of a life. 12 years of building something that someone else now wanted to take. He heard footsteps in the hallway and looked up to find Clara standing in the doorway in her robe, her hair loose around her shoulders, holding a lamp. She looked at him. She looked at the open cabinet. She looked at the envelope in his hands. "Tell me," she said quietly. He told her everything. She listened without interrupting, her face very still, and when he was done, she sat down in the chair behind the desk. Thomas's chair, he thought, and wondered how often she allowed herself to sit in it and looked at the documents he'd laid out on the surface. He was going to take these to Hale, she said. I think so. What was in them? I didn't go through all of them. But one document I could see was a survey record from 1873, the original land grant. If Hale had a copy of that, he'd know exactly what claims he could challenge and where the boundaries were most vulnerable. Clara pressed her fingers to her mouth for a moment. Then she lowered her hand and looked up at him with an expression that broke something loose in his chest. Not grief exactly, not anger, but something that was both and neither, something purely human in its exhaustion. How long has he been doing this? She said, not really asking him, asking the room, asking the empty chair across from her, asking the husband who wasn't there anymore. Ethan didn't answer. She gathered herself with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been gathering herself without help for 2 years. She straightened. She looked at the papers and then at him. Thank you, she said. For staying. For seeing it. It's my job, he said. She looked at him for a moment. No, she said. It isn't. Not this part. He didn't argue with her. He left her alone in the study with the lamp and the documents, and the ghost of the life she was still fighting to hold together. He walked back across the dark yard to the bunkhouse and lay on his cot and stared at the ceiling. He told himself he'd be gone by spring. He told himself that every night for the rest of the month, and every night it felt a little less true. The Buford brothers' departure left the ranch short 2 hands, which meant more work for everyone, which meant more hours working alongside Clara. She was not easy to work alongside, not because she was difficult, she wasn't, but because she was relentlessly competent in a way that somehow made it harder to maintain the professional distance Ethan was determined to keep. She could mend a fence almost as fast as he could. She could read the weather by the color of the sky and the way the cattle moved, and she was right more often than she was wrong. She knew every hand's strengths and weaknesses, and she gave instructions with the directness of someone who had long since stopped worrying about whether she was supposed to be in charge. And she worked herself too hard. He saw it the way she pushed past the point of exhaustion, the lines of tiredness around her eyes that were there most mornings before the day had even started. He didn't say anything about it for a while. It wasn't his place. But one afternoon, 3 weeks before the first hard frost, he came in from checking the south pasture to find her in the barn repairing a broken harness by lantern light at what had to be 7 in the evening, her hands trembling slightly with fatigue. Go to sleep, he said from the barn door. She didn't look up. I'll be done in a few minutes. Clara. She stopped, looked at him. In the lamplight, the exhaustion on her face was unmistakable. This will still be here tomorrow, he said. So will everything else that needs doing. Yes. He walked in and sat down on the bench beside her and took the harness out of her hands, not roughly, just steadily, the way you'd take a weight from someone who'd been holding it too long. She let go without a fight, which told him more than anything else could have about how tired she actually was. I can finish this, he said. She sat there for a moment, her hands empty in her lap, and he thought she might protest. Instead, she put her face in her hands and pressed hard against her eyes, and let out a single long, controlled breath, the breath of someone who had been holding everything in for a very long time. I can't let it fall, she said. Her voice was muffled in her palms. If I let any of it fall even a little bit, it will all... She stopped, took her hands from her face, straightened up. Sorry, she said. That wasn't... Don't apologize, he said quietly. She looked at him sideways. Thomas used to tell me I was the strongest person he knew. A pause. Some days I wonder if he actually believed that, or if he was just saying it because I needed to hear it. Ethan continued working on the harness, his hands moving steadily. He was probably both, he said. People are both. She was quiet for a moment. "Were you ever married, Mr. Walker?" He'd been waiting for that question for weeks. "No," he said. "Close once, but the timing wasn't right." He paused. "And then I lost the ranch, and the timing stopped mattering." What happened to the ranch? He told her the basic shape of it. The drought. The debt he couldn't service. The land he'd broken his back building up over 5 years, sold in a single afternoon to pay what he owed. The way he'd ridden away from it, and never looked back, because looking back was the one thing he couldn't afford to do. She listened, the way she always listened, completely without interrupting, giving every word its proper weight. "That's why you move around," she said when he finished. "I find it's easier not to care too much about what's temporary." She looked at him. "Is that working for you?" The question landed somewhere it wasn't supposed to. He kept his eyes on the harness. "Well enough," he said. She stood up. In the lamplight, her face was very calm and very serious. "Good night, Ethan," she said. He heard his first name from her mouth and felt it like a small, significant thing. "Good night," he said. She walked out. He finished the harness in the quiet and sat alone for a while after it was done in the dark barn, with the horses breathing softly around him, and didn't think about anything in particular, and thought about everything at once. Victor Hale came to the ranch himself on a cold gray morning in late October. He arrived with 2 men behind him, and a smile that Ethan recognized immediately, the particular smile of a man who believes he's already won and is just going through the motions of the conversation for form's sake. Clara met him on the porch. Ethan stayed in the yard close enough to hear everything far enough not to make it a confrontation before it needed to be one. "Mrs. Whitfield," Hale said, tipping his hat. He was a large man, well-dressed for the frontier, with silver at his temples and the kind of bearing that money and certainty put into a person over a long time. "You're looking well." "Mr. Hale, I didn't know you were coming." "Forgive the surprise. I was in the area." He glanced at the property behind her with the appraising eye of someone measuring up what they intend to acquire. "Beautiful morning." "What do you want, Victor?" The smile didn't waver. "I've had my people look into a few things regarding the water rights on the Northern Creek. There's a question, a legal question, purely technical, about whether the original homestead claim covers continuous use." He paused. "I'd hate for that to become a problem for you heading into winter." Silence. Ethan watched Clara's face. It didn't change. "I see," she said. "My offer stands," Hale said. "The same as before, plus 10%. I've been generous because I respect what Thomas built here. But this water rights matter could tie things up in the territorial courts for months, and winter isn't the time for that kind of uncertainty." "No," Clara said. Hale blinked. "Excuse me. The answer is no. It was no the first time, the second time, and the third time, and it's no now." Her voice was perfectly level. "And Mr. Hale, if you file a claim on that creek, I'll be ready for you." Hale looked at her for a long moment. Then his gaze shifted to Ethan, and something in his expression sharpened slightly, a reassessment like he was revising a calculation. "New hand," he said. "Good morning," Ethan said. Hale studied him. Then he looked back at Clara with the particular expression of a man who has just decided to change his method. "Think about what I've said, Mrs. Whitfield. Winter is coming, and some burdens are heavier than one person should carry." "Good day, Mr. Hale," Clara said. She didn't go inside until his horse was out of sight. Then she turned and walked past Ethan into the yard, and stood with her back to him, her arms crossed tight, her head down. "He's going to do it," she said. "Yes?" "He's going to file the claim." "Yes." She turned around. Her eyes were bright, not with tears, but with the particular fire of someone who has just fully committed to a fight. "Then we need to be ready. We need documentation. We need witnesses. We need—" "I know," Ethan said. "Let's start." She looked at him for a moment with something in her face that he couldn't fully read and didn't try to. "You don't have to do this," she said. "This isn't what you hired on for." "I know what I hired on for." "Ethan." She said his name the way she'd said it in the barn, carefully, deliberately, like it mattered. "You can walk away from this. If it gets ugly, and it will get ugly, you don't have any obligation." "Clara," he said. She stopped. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. A long moment passed between them, there in the cold October yard, with the gray sky pressing down and the winter coming on, and Victor Hale riding away somewhere to set his machines in motion. And in that moment, something shifted between them. Something that had been building for weeks, carefully avoided, carefully not named, settled into the air between them and stayed. Neither of them said anything about it, but they both knew it was there. "Thank you," she finally said. "Don't thank me," he said. "Just get the records together. We've got work to do." She almost smiled, and for just a moment, despite the weight of everything pressing down on both of them, despite the cold and the coming fight, and all the loss they each carried around like stones in their pockets, the morning felt like something other than a problem. It felt briefly like the beginning of something. The records were spread across every surface of Thomas Whitfield's study. By the time Ethan and Clara finished pulling them from the cabinets, survey maps, cattle registers, water usage, logs, receipts for irrigation work going back to 1874. 13 years of careful documentation, everything dated and initialed in Thomas's precise hand, and Clara had maintained them in the same meticulous way after he died, adding her own records in her own handwriting to the same ledgers he'd started. Looking at it all laid out together, Ethan felt something like relief. This was more than he'd hoped for. "Your husband kept good records," he said. "He was an accountant before he was a rancher," Clara said. She was standing on the other side of the desk, sorting documents into categories with quick, practiced hands. "He always said the paperwork was as important as the cattle, that a ranch without proper records was just land waiting to be taken." She paused with a document in her hands. He was right about that. Ethan picked up a water usage log from 1876. The entries went all the way back to the first months of the homestead, not just how much water was used, but where it came from, which sources, which dates. "This is exactly what we need," he said. "Continuous use. Documented continuously." "Is it enough?" He was quiet for a moment, thinking it through. "For the territorial court, probably yes. The question is whether we can get it in front of the right judge before Hale gets his filing established. Once he's on record with a claim, even a weak one, the process slows down, and that's exactly what he wants. He wants you going through a legal winter while the ranch bleeds." Clara set down her stack of papers and looked at him directly. "You know how this works." "I know how men like Hale work," Ethan said. "They don't win by being right. They win by making the fight last long enough that the other person runs out of money or patience. We need to be faster than he expects." "Then we ride to Cascade tomorrow," Clara said. "I know the land commissioner there. Commissioner Aldridge. He knew Thomas. They served together on a county water board years ago. If anyone is going to hear our case fairly, it's him." "Does Hale know Aldridge?" Clara's expression shifted slightly. "Yes, they've done business." Ethan let that sit. "Then we need to be there first. And we need to bring more than documents. We need witnesses, people who can testify to how long this land has been in use, how long you've been drawing from that creek." "I know people," Clara said. "Old settlers. The Hendersons up near the North Ridge, they've been on their land since before Thomas filed. And there's a man named August Riley who worked this property back in the 70s before Thomas bought it from the original homesteaders. He lives in Cascade now, if he's still alive." "Find out," Ethan said. She met his eyes. There was energy in her now, not the exhausted determination he'd grown used to seeing, but something sharper, more alive, fueled by the fact that they finally had a direction to move in. He recognized that feeling. He'd felt it himself once a long time ago, when he still believed problems had solutions you could work toward. He'd let himself forget that for a while. "We'll need to leave early," she said. "I'll have the horses ready by 4. She nodded. She started to gather the most critical documents into a separate pile for the ride. Then she stopped and looked up at him with a question in her face that she seemed to be deciding whether to ask. "What is it?" he said. "Why are you doing this?" she said. "Not the job, not the cattle. This." She gestured at the documents spread between them. "You didn't come here for a legal fight, Ethan. You could walk away right now and find work somewhere else inside a week. So why aren't you?" It was the most direct she'd ever been with him, and it landed in a place he hadn't been prepared for. He looked at her across the desk and thought about the honest answer, which was complicated in ways he hadn't fully sorted out himself, and settled for the part of it that was simplest and most true. "Because it's the right thing," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. "That's not all of it." "No," he admitted. "It isn't." She didn't press him. She looked down at the documents in her hands, and he thought she understood more than he'd said, which made him more uncomfortable and less uncomfortable in equal measure. "Get some sleep," she said quietly. 4 o'clock comes early." He left her in the study with the lamp burning and walked back across the dark yard, and the cold air felt different than it had an hour ago, carrying something it hadn't carried before, though he couldn't have said exactly what. Tutta. Miguel had news waiting for him at the bunkhouse. He was sitting on the steps when Ethan came across the yard, and even in the dark, Ethan could read the posture, that specific stillness that meant something had happened. "Talk," Ethan said. Miguel pulled a folded paper from his jacket and held it out. "Boy from town brought this about an hour ago. Addressed to Mrs. Whitfield, but he handed it to me because she had someone in the house." He paused. "It's from the Territorial Land Office. Hale already filed." Ethan took the paper and read it in the thin light coming from the bunkhouse window. It was a formal notice, a water rights claim filed that afternoon by Victor Hale, citing disputed ownership of the creek access running through the northern section of Rose Creek Ranch. There was a hearing date. 3 weeks away. 3 weeks. "He moved fast," Miguel said quietly. "Faster than I expected." Ethan folded the notice and looked at it in his hand. "He knew we were gathering our records. Someone told him. The Bufords are gone. Doesn't mean they were the only ones talking." Ethan stood for a moment thinking. "Has anyone been into town in the last 2 days?" Miguel was quiet. "Miguel, Danny rode in yesterday for supplies," Miguel said. He said it carefully, the way a man says something he doesn't want to say. "He was gone longer than the errand would have needed." Ethan didn't say anything for a moment. He thought about Danny, the 19-year-old who'd spotted the broken spur horse on the east pasture and reported it without hesitation. He thought about the way Danny had looked at him since then, easy and open, without any of the sideways tension the Bufords had carried. He thought about how good a deceiver Danny could be if he'd wanted to be. "Don't assume," Ethan said finally. "But watch him." "What do you want me to do?" "Nothing yet. We're riding to Cascade tomorrow, Clara and I. Keep the ranch moving. Keep your eyes open. And if anything happens while I'm gone..." He stopped. "I'll handle it," Miguel said. Ethan looked at him. 6 years this man had stayed on this ranch through the death of its owner and the legal pressure and the sabotage and the slow bleeding of resources. Not for wages alone. Not for any reason a man could fully put into words. "I know you will," Ethan said. He went inside and lay on his cot and put the notice on his chest and looked at the ceiling. 3 weeks. It wasn't much time, but it was enough time if they moved right. He ran through everything they needed, the documents, the witnesses, the specific legal provisions that Clara had already identified in the territorial statutes. He thought about Commissioner Aldridge and the business he'd done with Hale, and whether that connection was deep enough to be a problem. He was still running through it when he heard the creak of the bunkhouse door, and looked up to find Clara standing in the doorway. She was still dressed. She had the lamp in her hand, and she looked at him without saying anything for a moment, and he sat up. "You saw the notice," he said. "Danny just came to tell me." She stepped inside, letting the door fall shut behind her. "He said he didn't know what it was when he delivered the letter to Hale's man in town. that he was paid to carry a message and didn't know what was in it. Do you believe him? A long pause. I don't know. He seemed genuinely frightened. Frightened people tell the truth, Ethan said. And frightened people tell whatever story gets them out of trouble. Both things are equally true. Clara sat down on this bench near the wall, her lamp beside her. She looked more tired than she had an hour ago, and something more than tired. Something that was closer to the specific loneliness of a person who has been managing alone for so long that even a near ally feels like a stranger in the hardest moments. 3 weeks, she said. It's enough. Is it? Yes. If we move tomorrow, and if Aldridge is straight with us. He looked at her. Are you worried about Aldridge? She pressed her lips together. Aldridge is an honest man. Or he was. But Hale has a way of making honest men feel like they're being practical instead of compromised. She paused. Thomas trusted Aldridge. That matters to me. But Thomas has been gone for 2 years, and 2 years is a long time for a man's principles to drift. It was the most cynical thing he'd heard her say, and it struck him as true and painful in the way that things earned through experience always are. Then we make sure he has no reason to drift on this one, Ethan said. We walk in there with documentation so solid, there's no legal daylight for him to maneuver in. We make it simple, clear, undeniable. She looked at him for a long moment. You're very certain for a man who just said 3 weeks ago that he wasn't planning to stay past spring. The words hit harder than she probably intended, or maybe she intended them exactly that hard. I'm certain about the case, he said carefully. Are you? She tilted her head slightly. Or are you certain about something else? The lamplight between them held something that neither of them reached for. He let the silence run out to its natural edge, and then he said, We should sleep. 4 o'clock. She stood. She picked up her lamp. She looked at him one more time with that expression he was beginning to know, the one that said she saw more than he was showing, and she was deciding how much to say about it. Good night, Ethan, she said, and went out. He lay back on his cot and put one arm over his eyes and didn't sleep for a long, long time. They left before the sky was fully light, and they made good time, and it was in that long, cold ride to Cascade that Ethan first began to understand the particular quality of Clara's silence. Most people, when they were silent in company, were simply not talking. But Clara's silence was active. She was always thinking inside, it turning things over, arriving at conclusions she'd share when she was ready and not before. He recognized this because he did something similar, and people who communicated the same way didn't grate on each other the way mismatched pairs did. They'd been writing 2 hours before she said anything. Tell me about your survey work, she said. He glanced at her. What about it? How did you end up doing it? He thought about the question. It wasn't the kind of question he got often, and the fact that she was asking it told him something about how her mind worked. She'd been thinking about his background, about how it connected to the case, about what skills he had that she hadn't fully accounted for yet. A man named Collins, Ethan said. I worked for him after I left my first cattle job when I was about 23. He was a government surveyor out of Helena. He needed someone who could ride hard in difficult terrain and do basic mathematics. I could do both. He paused. I worked with him for 2 years, covering most of the Northern Territory. Learned how land claims were documented, how boundary disputes were adjudicated, how the homestead laws interacted with water rights and grazing rights. Another pause. It was the most useful education I ever got, and I walked away from it when Collins retired because I thought cattle work was where I belonged. Do you wish you'd stayed with it? Some days, he said honestly. On the days when I'm mending someone else's fences for the 4th time in a row, yes. She almost smiled. He could see it from the side, the small shift at the corner of her mouth. You're better suited to this than you let on, she said. To what? To staying somewhere, to being part of something that requires more than just your hands. She kept her eyes on the road ahead. You talk about the survey work the way people talk about things they gave up too early. He thought about denying it. Maybe, he said instead. The ranch you lost, she said, still not looking at him. How long did you have it? 5 years. What was it like? He hadn't talked about this to anyone in a very long time. He found the answer moving through him with less resistance than he expected. Small. About 300 acres up near the Madison River. Good land. I was building it year by year, planned to run about 150 head once I had the pasture established. He was quiet for a moment. The drought hit in 81. 2 seasons almost without rain. I'd borrowed against the land to expand the previous year, and the bank held the note. When the cattle started dying, I couldn't service the debt, and they called it. Gave me 30 days. Did you fight it? I tried. There wasn't enough to fight with. He paused. I didn't have what you have. I didn't have the documentation. I didn't have Thomas Whitfield's 12 years of careful records. I had my word against a banker's accounting. Clara was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry, she said. It was a long time ago. Loss doesn't have an expiration date, she said simply, and the plainness of it caught him off guard. He looked at her, and she was looking ahead, her face calm and serious, and he understood that she meant it not as philosophy, but as personal fact. She knew this from the inside. No, he said quietly. It doesn't. They rode in silence for a while after that, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Smaller. Warmer. The kind that forms between people who have just handed each other something real and handled it with care. August Riley was alive. He was 71 years old, moved slowly on account of his knees, and lived in a small house on the edge of Cascade with a vegetable garden that he tended with evident pride. When Clara knocked on his door, and he opened it and recognized her, his face went through so many things at once that Ethan had to look away for a moment. Clara Whitfield, the old man said. Lord Almighty, you look just like yourself. Mr. Riley. She took his hand in both of hers and held it. I need your help. They sat in his small front room, and Clara explained the situation plainly, and Ethan watched August Riley's face go through several more changes. Surprise, then anger, then a particular kind of steadiness that old men have when they've decided to do something and stopped worrying about whether it's going to be easy. Hail, Riley said with a flatness that carried decades of opinion about the man without requiring further comment. He's been buying up the valley piece by piece for 20 years. I watched him do it. Some he bought fair. Some... He shook his head. The creek on the northern section, Clara said. You were on that land in 1873 and 1874. You remember the water. Remember it. Riley looked at her like the question barely needed answering. I helped dig the original irrigation channel from that creek in the spring of 73. Me and 2 other men. We worked 3 weeks on it. That channel fed the original homestead. Thomas's predecessor used that water every season for 7 years before Thomas bought the land, and Thomas never let a season pass without drawing from it. He paused. I'll swear to that in any court in Montana. Clara let out a breath that had clearly been tightly held. There's one other thing, Ethan said. Both of them looked at him. Mr. Riley, when you dug that channel in 73, was there anyone from the territorial government present? A surveyor, an official of any kind? Riley thought for a moment. Collins, he said. Government man, tall fellow. He was doing a survey run through the valley. He signed off on the original homestead filing. Ethan felt something click into place in his chest. Is Collins still alive? Last I heard he was up in Helena. Retired, but alive. Riley looked between them curiously. You know him. I worked for him, Ethan said. Clara turned and looked at him with an expression that was equal parts surprise and something that might have been wonder. He looked back at her steadily. Well, Riley said, watching them both. Seems like the Lord provides. Commissioner Aldridge's office smelled like wood polish and old paper, and the man himself was smaller than Ethan had expected from Clara's description. Compact, precise, with careful eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses that took in both of them as they settled into the chairs across from his desk. He listened without interrupting while Clara laid out the situation. He looked at the documents she'd brought. He asked 2 or 3 questions, sharp and direct, that told Ethan he understood exactly what was at stake and was not going to pretend otherwise. When she finished, there was a silence. "Victor filed yesterday afternoon," Aldridge said. "We know," Clara said. "The hearing is in 3 weeks." He looked at the documents in front of him. "This is substantial, Clara. The usage logs alone are compelling." He paused, and Ethan watched his face, looking for the drift Clara had worried about, the subtle lean toward the easier outcome. "But I need to be honest with you. Hale has engaged a very good lawyer out of Bozeman, a man named Carver. I know his work. He is going to challenge the continuity of use, and he's going to argue that the 1873 filing had a procedural defect that invalidates the original claim." "What kind of defect?" Ethan said. Aldridge looked at him with slightly increased attention, as if recalibrating. "The original homestead filing was made under the Federal Act, but the water rights were recorded under territorial law. Carver will argue there's a jurisdictional gap between them." "That gap doesn't hold up," Ethan said. "The territorial water law of 1871 explicitly recognized prior appropriation claims made under federal homestead filings as long as continuous use could be established. We have continuous use. We have documentation. And we have an eyewitness who was present at the original irrigation work in 1873. Aldridge looked at him with full attention now. "You know the statutes." "I know enough." Aldridge looked at Clara, then back at Ethan. Something had changed in the room's temperature, something that Ethan recognized as the specific shift of a conversation when one party realizes the other is better prepared than anticipated. "Who are you?" Aldridge said, not rudely, carefully. "Ethan Walker. I'm employed at Rose Creek Ranch." "He worked as a government survey assistant under Collins in the early 80s, Clara said. "And Collins was present at the original 1873 filing." A pause. "Is Collins willing to testify?" "We haven't reached him yet," Ethan said. "But we will." Aldridge took off his glasses and cleaned them with a cloth from his desk, which Ethan had come to understand was the physical expression of thinking something through. He put them back on. "Bring me Collins if you can reach him," he said. "Bring me your witness from 73. Bring everything you have in writing." He looked at Clara. "I'll give you a fair hearing, Clara. I owe Thomas that much. But I can't give you a favorable ruling just because I knew him. You'll need to win this on the evidence." "That's all I'm asking for," Clara said. Aldridge nodded. He stood and shook her hand, then Ethan's, and held Ethan's a fraction of a second longer than necessary, looking at him with the evaluating expression of a man who has just identified something he wasn't expecting. "Find Collins," he said directly to Ethan. "I will," Ethan said. They were back on the street a few minutes later, the cold air sharp after the warmth of Aldridge's office, and Clara stopped and turned to him before either of them said anything, and looked at him with a full, clear-eyed expression that he didn't have a ready defense for. "Collins," she said. "I know where to send a wire. This whole time, the man who surveyed the original filing was someone you worked for." "I didn't know that until Riley said his name," Ethan said. "I'm not—" "I know you're not." She cut him off quietly, not sharp, just certain. "I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm just—" She stopped. She looked away for a moment, and then back at him, and what was in her face was something he'd seen before, only in its earliest form, something that was now fuller and less guarded. "I'm just realizing that you walked onto my ranch with more of what we needed than either of us knew." He didn't have an answer for that. It was true, and it was complicated, and it sat in the space between them in the cold Cascade afternoon, alongside everything else that was true and complicated. "I'll wire Helena from the telegraph office," he said. "Yes," she said, and then softer, "Thank you." "You've said that before," he said. "I'll probably keep saying it." She turned and started walking, and he fell into step beside her, and the distance between them as they walked was slightly less than it had been in the morning, not by any choice either of them made consciously, but simply because it had become natural, and neither of them moved to correct it. The wire to Collins went out that afternoon, They ate dinner at a small place near the telegraph office, and over the meal, Clara talked about Thomas, not the way she usually did, briefly, and with protective restraint, but openly, with the ease of someone who had finally found a listener she didn't have to explain herself to. She told Ethan about the first years on the ranch, when the house was barely more than a cabin, and they'd had 12 head and more hope than sense. She told him about the hard years in the middle, when a fever went through the cattle, and they'd lost almost everything, and Thomas had sat at the kitchen table for 3 days, refusing to discuss defeat. She told him about the good years after that, when the ranch had grown beyond anything they'd originally imagined, and she'd found a particular kind of happiness that she'd never expected to be so complete. Ethan listened. He asked questions when they felt right. He didn't fill the silence with words that weren't needed. At some point, Clara looked at him across the table and said, "You're very easy to talk to for a man who says almost nothing." "I say things when they're worth saying," he said. Thomas was the same way. She said it simply, not as a comparison or a burden, just as a fact observed. "Most people talk because they're uncomfortable with silence. You don't." "Neither do you," he said. She looked at him for a moment, and then she smiled fully this time. Not the almost smile, or the edge of something held back, but a real smile that changed her whole face, and Ethan felt it like a fist around his heart, which frightened him considerably. He looked down at his coffee. "The reply from Collins won't come until tomorrow morning at the earliest," she said. "We'll need to stay the night. I know the woman who runs the boarding house on Mill Street. She'll have 2 rooms." "Good," he said. But when they left the restaurant and walked toward the boarding house, the night was cold and clear, and the stars were enormous above the high street, and Clara stopped for just a moment and looked up and said, almost to herself, "Thomas used to say you could measure how far from home you were by how many stars you could see." Ethan stopped beside her and looked up with her. "You can see a lot from here," he said. She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was quieter. "Yes, you can." They stood there together for a moment, under the enormous Montana sky, and Ethan made himself very aware of the distance between them, the inch or two of cold air, the exact line where that kind of awareness became something else. He took a breath and started walking again. She fell into step, and neither of them looked at each other, and neither of them needed to. Collins wired back the next morning at 7:30. The message was brief and entirely characteristic of the man Ethan remembered: blunt, economical, utterly unambiguous. "Remember the 1873 creek filing well. Will come if needed. Tell Walker about damn time he stopped running." Clara read it over Ethan's shoulder. She was close enough that he could feel the warmth of her in the cold telegraph office, and he was aware of it with every part of his attention that wasn't focused on the paper in his hands. "He knows you well," she said. "Better than I thought," Ethan said. She was quiet for a moment. "About damn time he stopped running," she said carefully. She wasn't asking him to explain it. She was letting it sit between them, which was worse and better than explaining it. "Collins always said what he meant," Ethan said. "Seems like a good quality in a witness," she said. They rode home that afternoon with 2 witnesses, committed documentation in order, and 3 weeks to prepare a case that Ethan believed with a calm and serious certainty he hadn't felt about anything in a long time they could win. The wind had died down, and the ride back was smoother than the morning, and the miles went by in a way that felt different from the going, not longer or shorter, but somehow more settled, like the land between them and home had shifted slightly in proportion to something they hadn't yet put words to. They were an hour from the ranch when Clara said without turning, "My husband built everything he had on his own terms. He never let anyone take anything from him that wasn't given freely." "I know," Ethan said. "I can see it in everything he made." "I'm not going to lose it," she said. "I am not going to lose this ranch." "You're not," Ethan said. He meant it with everything in him. She looked at him, then straight and level with the last of the afternoon light falling across her face. "How sure are you?" He met her gaze without flinching. "Sure enough," he said. She held his gaze for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she looked forward again, and she rode a little straighter after that, her shoulders easier, and Ethan rode beside her and thought about Collins's 4 words telegraphed across 200 miles of Montana winter, and about how for the first time since he'd lost his own land, he was somewhere he didn't want to leave before morning came. That thought alone was enough to keep him quiet all the rest of the way home. When they rode into the yard and Miguel came out to take the horses, he looked at them both with the expression of a man who sees more than he comments on and decides not to comment on any of it. "Danny," Ethan said quietly. "Any problems?" "No," Miguel said. He glanced at Clara as she went inside. Then he looked back at Ethan. "Hale's man came by this afternoon. Just rode past the front gate twice and left." "Checking on us?" Ethan said. "Yes." Miguel handed back the reins. He didn't like what he saw. "What did he see?" Miguel smiled slowly for the first time in weeks. "Lights on, people working, a ranch that isn't planning on going anywhere." He paused. Made him look frustrated. Ethan put the horses up himself, working slowly in the quiet barn. And when he was done, he stood in the dark for a moment and listened to the land outside, the wind in the grass, the distant cattle, the creak of the house where a woman was putting on a lamp and probably already opening her legal books again. He'd told himself for 6 years that he was a man who didn't stay. Standing in that barn in the cold Montana dark, he was beginning to understand that had never been the truth of him. It had just been the story he'd told so long it had started to feel like one. The first thing Ethan did when he got back to the ranch that night was check the north pasture fence line. Not because he expected to find anything he'd asked Miguel to check it twice while they were gone, but because his instincts were telling him something. And after 6 years of traveling alone, he'd learned to trust his instincts more than his logic when the two disagreed. He found the cut on the 3rd post from the river bend. Not a break. Not weather damage. A clean cut made with wire snips low on the post, where it would be hardest to see without getting down on your knees in the dark. Someone had been on this land within the last 24 hours, and they'd been careful about it. If the fence had failed during the night, cattle would have drifted north toward the creek, and by morning, they'd have been scattered across 3 pastures in the dark and cold, and the count would have taken a full day to restore. A full day Ethan and Clara wouldn't have had to spare with the hearing 12 days away. He stood up and looked out toward the tree line to the north and felt a cold that had nothing to do with the November air. Hale was accelerating. He fixed the fence himself in the dark with wire from his saddlebag working by feel and the thin light of the moon, and then rode back to the barn and put his horse up without waking anyone. He sat on the bench in the tack room for a long time, turning over what he knew. The Bufords were gone. Danny had carried a message he claimed not to understand. Someone had been on the fence line tonight, someone who knew exactly where to cut and exactly how to make it look like an accident, which meant Hale had someone else inside. Or someone on the perimeter who knew the land well enough to move across it in the dark without a lantern. Ethan thought about that for a very long time. In the morning, he told Clara before he told anyone else. She was in the kitchen when he came in, already up, already dressed, a pot of coffee on the stove, and the legal documents spread across the table that she'd been reviewing since before dawn. She looked up when he came through the door and read something in his face immediately. "What happened?" she said. He told her about the fence. He told her about his read on the situation, that the Bufords hadn't been the whole problem, that Hale had at least one more source of information or access close to the property. He watched her face as he talked, and he watched her make the same calculation he'd made in the night, the same cold arithmetic of wondering who among the people she trusted was not fully trustworthy. "Danny," she said. "Maybe. Or someone outside entirely who knows the land. There are 3 men who worked here before Thomas bought the original homestead," she said slowly. "2 of them are in Wyoming. One—" She stopped. "Who?" "A man named Reardon, Frank Reardon. He was the foreman here before Thomas. He knows every inch of this land, every fence line, every weak point." She paused. "He left on bad terms. Thomas had to let him go after he started drinking. I've seen him twice in town since then. Both times Hale was somewhere nearby. That's not proof." Ethan said. No, but it's a shape. She looked at the documents in front of her and then back at him. We can't stop it from happening. We can't watch every inch of fence every night. No, Ethan agreed. But we can make sure whatever he does doesn't matter by winning the hearing before he can do enough damage. He sat down across from her. 12 days. What do we still need? She pulled a piece of paper from the top of the stack, a list in her handwriting, organized and precise. Collins is confirmed. Riley is confirmed. I have 9 years of water usage logs with continuous entries. I have the original survey record from 1873 and the homestead filing with the water rights notation. What I don't have... She tapped a specific section of the list. The 1878 drought records. What are those? During the drought of 78, the territorial government did a water usage audit of all ranches in the valley. They were trying to establish who had prior claim to creek access in case they needed to manage distribution. Thomas submitted a detailed report. If that report is in the territorial records, it's essentially a government confirmation of our water use going back to 78. She looked up. But I need a copy. The original is in Helena in the Land Office archive. Ethan was already calculating. Someone needs to ride to Helena. It's 4 days each way. 8 days total. That leaves 4 days before the hearing. He looked at her steadily. I'll go. You can't go, she said immediately. I need you here. Hale is escalating, and Miguel is good, but he's not. She stopped herself, regrouped. I need you here, Ethan. The directness of it landed in him like something warm and weighted. He held her gaze. Then who? She was quiet for a moment. I'll write to Commissioner Aldridge. He has access to the archive. If I ask him to locate the record and hold a copy for us, his office can send it by courier. She paused. It'll cost us 2 days of waiting. Do it today, Ethan said. First thing. She was already reaching for pen and paper. Ned. The letter went out that morning, and they settled into the grim focused work of the remaining days. Ethan reorganized the watch rotation himself, Miguel and Danny in shifts with Ethan taking the late hours himself, because he slept lightly on the best nights and barely at all now. He rode the fence lines twice daily. He checked the water sources every morning. He watched the tree lines. And he watched Danny. The young man worked without complaint, as tireless as he'd always been, as willing and open in manner. There was nothing in his behavior that suggested guilt, and nothing that fully cleared him either. Ethan observed him the way he observed everything difficult quietly from several angles without tipping his hand. On the 4th day, Danny found him mending a post in the east pasture and came up on foot, which was unusual, and stood at a distance until Ethan looked up. Something on your mind, Ethan said. Danny pushed his hat back and looked at the ground for a moment. I need to tell you something, he said, about the message I carried to town. Tell me. I told Mrs. Whitfield I didn't know what was in it. He looked up. His face was young and complicated. That was true, but I knew who gave it to me, and I didn't tell her that part. Ethan set down his tools. Who gave it to you? Reardon, Danny said. Frank Reardon. He found me outside the feed store and said he had a letter that needed to go to the land office, and could I take it along since I was riding to town anyway. I didn't think anything of it. I didn't know who Reardon was, or what he was connected to. He paused. I found out 2 days later when I heard Miguel talking about Hale's men, and He stopped. You should have told us then, Ethan said. I know, Danny said. He wasn't making excuses. He just said it flat, the way a young man says something he knows is true and can't undo. Ethan looked at him for a long moment. The kid was not a plant. He was 19 years old, and he'd made a bad decision through ignorance, and then a worse one through fear of what admitting it would cost him. Ethan knew the shape of that particular mistake from the inside. You just told me, Ethan said. Yes, that matters. Don't do anything stupid between now and the hearing, and we'll be fine. He picked up his tools again. And Danny, if Reardon or anyone else approaches you again, you come to me before you do anything. You understand? Yes, sir, Danny said. The relief on his face was so complete, it was almost painful to see. Reardon's involvement changed the calculation. Ethan brought it to Clara that evening, and she listened with the specific stillness she used when she was processing something that had emotional weight alongside its practical implications. Frank Reardon Thomas's former foreman, a man who had known this land as well as anyone alive, actively working to help Victor Hale take it. He blamed Thomas for firing him, she said. He always did. He believed Thomas owed him a share of the ranch for the years he put in before the sale. Thomas offered him a fair wage and a fair severance, and Reardon said it wasn't enough. She was quiet for a moment. I always thought he was just bitter. I didn't think he'd... She stopped. He's been giving Hale operational information, Ethan said. He knows which sections of fence are oldest. He knows the water system. He knows where the vulnerable points are. And he knows the property layout well enough to move across it at night without a lamp, Clara said. Yes. She put both hands on the table and looked at them. Can we prove it? Danny's testimony about the message connects him to Hale's camp, but it's not enough for legal action by itself. Ethan paused. What it does is tell us he's going to do something before the hearing. Something bigger than cut fences. What? I don't know yet. But Hale is running out of time to make a move that disrupts the hearing, and Reardon is going to be his instrument. Ethan looked at her. I need you to promise me something. She looked up. I need you to promise me that you won't go anywhere alone between now and the hearing. Not into town, not to the outlying pastures, not anywhere you'd be without someone else present. Her chin came up slightly, the reflex of a woman who had been entirely self-reliant for 2 years and did not receive instructions easily. Ethan. Clara. He said her name with a quietness that was more serious than raised voices. Hale has cut fences. He's had your documents almost stolen. He's filed a fraudulent legal claim. Each thing he's done has been one step further than the last. I am not going to wait to find out what the next step is. A long silence. All right, she said. He nodded. Thank you. She looked at him with something in her face that was complicated enough that he didn't try to read all of it. You're very protective, she said, for someone who keeps telling himself he's just here for the cattle. He didn't answer that, but he didn't look away from her either, and the moment between them held everything that neither of them was saying, which was becoming a considerable amount. Commissioner Aldridge's courier arrived on the 7th day with a sealed envelope and a short personal letter that Aldridge had included at the bottom of the official documents. Clara read the official papers first, the 1878 drought audit record stamped and certified, confirming Rose Creek Ranch's water usage from the northern creek running back to the original 1873 filing. It was exactly what they needed. Then she read Aldridge's personal note. Her face changed. What is it? Ethan said. She handed him the note without speaking. Aldridge had written 3 sentences below his signature. Carver has filed a supplemental claim on behalf of Hale, alleging that the original 1873 water rights notation was made in error by a government surveyor who exceeded his authority. He will argue that Collins had no legal standing to certify water rights under the homestead filing. You need Collins at that hearing in person. A written statement will not be enough. Ethan read it twice. He set it down. Collins is in Helena, Clara said. 4 days away. 8 days round trip. His voice was level, but his mind was moving fast. The hearing is in 5 days. Yes. Silence. He's not going to make it in time by wagon or horse, Clara said. She was looking at Ethan with an expression that was a question and an answer at the same time. But if someone rode hard, I can make it in 3 days, Ethan said. If I ride through. She stared at him. That's 40 miles a day minimum. I know what it is. In November, through mountain passes. I know the territory. I surveyed most of it. He was already calculating Horse's supplies route. I can get to Helena, find Collins, and get back before the morning of the hearing if I leave tonight. Tonight, she repeated. Yes. She was very still. He could see her working through what it meant. Him gone the ranch without him for 4 days and 3 nights, Reardon somewhere out there with Hale's backing and an unspecified plan. He saw her weigh all of it against the absolute necessity of Collins's testimony. "Miguel will keep the ranch safe," Ethan said. "I'll talk to him before I go. Danny too." "I know Miguel can hold the ranch." She paused. "That's not what I'm thinking about." He looked at her. "I've been doing this alone for 2 years," she said quietly. "I'm not afraid of being alone. I know how to do it." Another pause. "I'd just gotten used to not having to." It was the most personally vulnerable thing she'd said to him since he arrived. She said it plainly without embellishment, and then looked at him with the straightforward gaze of a woman who has decided that if something is true, it might as well be said. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "I'll be back before the hearing," he said. "I promise you that." Something in her face shifted, accepting it, storing it, giving it the weight she gave to things she decided to trust. "All right," she said. "Go." He went to talk to Miguel. He left at 10 o'clock at night, with 2 horses his best, and a strong spare riding north by northwest toward the Helena Road with the cold coming down hard from the mountains. He pushed fast for the first hour while the horses were fresh, then settled into a pace he could sustain the kind of rhythm that covered miles without burning out the animal under you or the one you were leading. He'd made rides like this before. In his survey years, he'd ridden through worse country faster, under worse conditions. But he hadn't had anything riding on the outcome the way he did now, and the difference that made to the feeling of it was something he hadn't expected. He thought about Clara saying she'd gotten used to not having to do it alone. He rode. The mountains were cold and the passes were hard, and on the second day his spare horse threw a shoe on a rocky section of trail, and he spent 40 minutes fixing it with the tools in his kit, working in the cold, with fingers that didn't want to cooperate, talking to the horse in the low, calm voice that animals responded to better than urgency. He made Helena on the morning of the 3rd day, found Collins's address from a man at the land office who remembered him, and rode to a small house on the east side of the city, where an old man with white hair and a substantial beard answered the door in his suspenders, and looked at Ethan for a long moment before saying, "You look like Hellwalker." "I need 3 minutes," Ethan said. "Then I need you to pack a bag." Collins looked at him with the evaluating eye of a man who had spent his career in the field, reading terrain and making fast decisions. "Come in," he said. He'd kept his records. That was the first thing Ethan needed to know, and Collins established it within 60 seconds. A large wooden chest in his study contained his complete survey records from 1870 through 1884, organized by year and location, every entry signed and dated and filed according to the government protocols that gave them legal standing. He found the 1873 Rose Creek filing in under 10 minutes. "There it is," Collins said. He spread the document on his desk and they both looked at it. The original survey notation dated March 14, 1873, with Collins's signature and official seal confirming the water rights claim as part of the homestead filing. "I remember this one, clear as yesterday. That creek was feeding 3 different properties by then, and there were already disputes about it. I made sure to document the priority claim carefully." "Did you have legal standing to certify water rights under the Federal Homestead Act?" Ethan asked directly. Collins looked at him with a kind of sharp-focused amusement. "Is that what they're claiming?" "Carver's filing says the notation was made in error." Collins sat back. "The Territorial Surveying Act of 1869 explicitly granted government surveyors the authority to document and certify ancillary claims, including water rights, as part of any federal homestead filing processed in the territory. It was standard procedure. I did it 200 times. He paused. "Carver knows that. He's hoping the commissioner doesn't." "Aldridge is straight," Ethan said. "Then he needs to hear this from me directly," Collins said. "The hearing is in 2 days." Collins looked at him. He looked at his records. He looked at the coat hanging on the hook by the door, and he made the kind of decision that takes less than a second when a man has already decided who he is. "I'll need my good suit," he said. "My knees don't travel well in cold weather. and I want a decent meal when we stop." "I'll buy you two," Ethan said. Collins laughed a short, genuine bark of a sound. "Still the same Walker," he said. "You always could talk a man into the inconvenient thing." He stood and started moving toward his bedroom. "Tell me about this widow," he called over his shoulder. Ethan told him. He told him about Clara and the ranch, and the 2 years she'd held it together, and what Thomas Whitfield had built, and what Victor Hale was trying to steal, and why it mattered. He talked more in those 10 minutes than he'd talked about one subject in years, and he only realized that when he stopped and found Collins standing in the doorway of his bedroom with his bag half-packed, looking at him with an expression Ethan recognized. "You're not just there for the cattle," Collins said. "I'm there for the case," Ethan said. Collins smiled the specific smile of a man who is old enough to tell the difference and kind enough not to belabor it. "Of course you are," he said, and went back to packing. Boy. They made it back to Rose Creek Ranch the evening before the hearing. Ethan smelled smoke before they reached the gate. Not the smoke of chimneys or cook fires, the smoke of something burning that wasn't meant to burn coming from the direction of the south barn. He kicked his horse from a trot to a run without thinking about it, calling back to Collins to follow carefully, and came over the last rise to find Miguel and Danny and 2 neighboring men who'd come to help, all working to keep the fire from spreading. The south barn was burning already, past saving, but the main house and the north barn were not yet touched, and they were working hard to keep it that way. Clara was there. She was directing people with a calm authority that cost her everything she had. He could see that her face was controlled, but her hands were shaking, and there was soot on her face, and something in her eyes that she was holding back by force of will. When she saw Ethan ride in, she looked at him for 1 full second with an expression that collapsed and reassembled so fast he almost missed it. He dismounted and went to her. "Anyone hurt?" he said. "No. We got the animals out." She was already looking back at the fire. It started in the southeast corner, the locked section. No one should have been able to get in there. "Reardon," Ethan said. "Yes." Her voice was flat. "We found a lantern, broken, pushed in through the sideboards." Ethan turned and looked at the fire, and then at the main house, and then at the north barn. "How long ago?" 2 hours. Miguel saw it first. He'd been watching the south fence. She paused. He was watching the wrong fence. Reardon knew where he'd be watching. Yes. She finally looked at him fully. "Collins. Behind me on the road. He's got his records. He's ready." Something in her face that was not quite relief but was close to it. "The documents from the study," she said. "I moved everything this morning. Into the house, into the locked chest under my bedroom floor. Thomas built it in. I moved everything as soon as you left." Ethan stared at her. "You knew he was going to try for the documents." "I didn't know where he'd try. I was wrong about where." She looked at the burning barn. "But I wasn't wrong about when." He looked at her, this woman who had moved her documents before dawn and directed a fire response with shaking hands, and was standing here 5 minutes after his return, already thinking about the next step. He thought about Collins's question in Helena. He thought about what he'd said and what he hadn't said, and how far the distance was between those two things. "Clara," he said. She looked at him. "The barn can be rebuilt," he said. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She nodded. "I know. The records are safe. Collins is here. The hearing is tomorrow." He held her gaze. "He didn't stop us." She looked at him for a long moment, and in the flickering orange light of the burning barn, something passed through her face that she didn't fully contain: grief and relief and exhaustion, and something fiercer underneath all of it, something that refused to be extinguished no matter what Hale threw at it. "No," she said quietly. "He didn't." They stood there together for a moment while the fire burned and the men worked around them, and Ethan was aware of her beside him, in the particular way that had nothing to do with the job and everything to do with the person, and he let himself be aware of it without running from it for the first time since he'd arrived at this ranch. Collins came riding in slowly with his bad knees and his packed bag, and pulled up his horse and looked at the burning barn, and then at the two of them standing together, and said with his characteristic directness, "Well, I assume this means the other side is nervous." Clara looked at him. "You must be Collins. And you must be the woman Walker rode 40 miles a day through mountain passes in November for," Collins said pleasantly. "I can see why." Ethan did not look at Collins. Clara did not look at Ethan. But something shifted between them in that moment that all three of them felt, and Collins, being Collins, let the silence hold exactly long enough to make it meaningful before he swung stiffly down from his horse and said, "Now, someone promised me a decent meal, and we have a case to review before morning." They worked until midnight. Collins and Clara sat at the kitchen table with the documents spread between them. Collins going through each piece of evidence with the careful eye of a man who had spent 40 years making sure things were documented correctly, pointing out where they were strong and where Carver might find a seam to push into. Miguel brought coffee, and Ethan sat across from them, listening, adding pieces, tracking the overall shape of the argument, the way he'd learned from Collins 20 years ago, when evidence was terrain and an argument was a route across it. At one point, Collins picked up the 1878 drought audit record and looked at it for a long time. "This is the piece," he said. "This is what makes everything else unassailable. If the territorial government confirmed your water usage in 78 Carver's argument that the original 1873 notation was invalid collapses. A procedurally invalid claim can't be officially confirmed by the same government 5 years later. It's contradictory on its face." "He'll try to argue the 78 audit didn't specifically address prior rights," Clara said. "It does," Collins said. He pointed to a specific section of the document. Line 43, Priority Use Determination. "Your name, well, the original homesteader's name confirmed as transferred to Thomas Whitfield by the 1875 sale record." He tapped it. "This is airtight." Clara looked at Ethan. He nodded. "It's airtight." She looked at Collins. "How many times have you testified in a water rights case?" 17, Collins said. 114. Lost 2 when the judge was a fool. 1 I still argue about. The corner of Clara's mouth moved. "I'll take those odds." "You should," Collins said. "You have the better case. You have the better facts. And—" He glanced at Ethan with the infuriating equanimity of a very old man who has nothing to lose by saying true things. "You have better people." He closed his record book and stood up with the careful movements of a man whose knees were genuinely unhappy with him, picked up his coffee cup, and said good night with the brisk finality of a man who intended to sleep well and did. Ethan and Clara were left alone in the kitchen in the quiet. The fire outside had burned down to embers. The house was warm. The documents were in order. Collins was asleep in the spare room, and tomorrow morning they would ride into Cascade and stand in front of Commissioner Aldridge and make the case that this land and this water and this life had always belonged to the woman sitting across this table. Clara put her hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment. "I've been scared," she said, quietly, not confessing it to him, just stating it the way she stated true things. "Not of losing. I've made peace with the possibility of losing, but of having fought this hard and still—" She stopped. "You're not going to lose," he said. "You keep saying that." "Because I keep meaning it." She looked up at him. "Why does it matter so much to you, the legal outcome? Whether this specific ranch survives?" He held her gaze. "You know why," he said. A silence that was not quite silence. "I want to hear you say it," she said. He looked at her across the table, across the documents, and the evidence, and the 2 years of her fighting alone, and the 6 years of his running, and he thought about all the careful distances he'd maintained, and all the reasons he'd told himself those distances were necessary, and he thought about Collins's 4 words in the telegram, and about riding 40 miles a day through mountain passes in November, and about the way he'd felt when he smelled smoke from a mile out and couldn't get to her fast enough. "Because it's your home," he said. "And because—" He stopped. The words were there. They were all there. "Because you deserve to keep it." She looked at him for a long time. Then she looked down at her hands on the table. "That's most of it," she said quietly. "Yes," he admitted. "Most of it." She stood up. She gathered a few of the papers and squared them against the edge of the table, a gesture that was more habit than necessity. The motion of a woman who tidies things at the end of a day because it keeps the world organized. She picked up her lamp. "Sleep, Ethan," she said. "Tomorrow we go win." She walked out. He heard her footsteps on the stairs, slow and steady. The steps of someone who had been carrying weight for a long time and had learned to carry it without letting it show in how she moved. He sat alone in the kitchen with the cold coffee and the papers and the quiet. He thought about what she'd said. That's most of it. He thought about what he hadn't said. Which was the rest of it? Which was everything. He got up and blew out the lamp and walked to the bunkhouse through the cold November dark, and the stars above were exactly what Clara had said they were, the night in Cascade enormous and close, the kind you only saw when you were far from where you started. He thought he might be further from where he'd started than he'd realized. And for the first time in 6 years, that felt less like a problem than a fact worth sitting with. He slept better than he had any right to, and when he woke at 4 in the morning to the sound of wind and the distant low of Cattle Rose Creek Ranch, was whole and quiet around him, holding itself together in the dark, waiting for morning. Part 1. Lưu ý viết 4.500 đến 5.000 từ liên kết, liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hội thoại, tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề. Phụ phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc chân thực và gần gũi, không mô tả cảnh, tập trung vào hành động, cảm xúc và tâm lý nhân vật. Viết phần Hải đạt điểm 10 trên 10 và bổ sung tiết tấu câu chuyện nhanh, sửa lỗi AI kể. Theo ngôi thứ 3 tăng độ kịch tính, không viết lần màn kết thúc phần, không giới thiệu phần sau. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang mức document mới, 2 đến 3 phút cần có mini climax và đặt 10 đến 15 mini climax. Mỗi phần cứ 10 đến 12 phút có một twist lớn sâu sắc đan xen mini cliffhanger mạnh hơn, tăng tính tự nhiên cho phản ứng của các nhân vật, thêm nhịp điệu kịch tính thực tế và gần gũi. Mỗi 8 đến 10 phút cần có móc giữ chân khán giả. Lưu ý không mô tả cảnh và chỉ cần viết nội dung và viết đúng lệnh cho tôi. Show more. Part 4. The choice to stay. They rode into Cascade at 8:30 in the morning. The 5 of them, Clara, Ethan Collins, Miguel, and August Riley, who had been waiting at the edge of town when they came in, dressed in his best coat, his chin shaved clean, looking like a man who had decided this particular morning mattered and intended to honor it accordingly. He fell in beside Clara without ceremony, and she reached over and pressed his hand once without saying anything, and that was enough. The Territorial Land Office was a square, solid building on the main street, and there were more people outside it than Ethan had expected. Neighbors, ranchers from adjacent properties, a few men he recognized from the feed store and the telegraph office. Some of them he'd never seen before, but Clara seemed to know them all, and as they dismounted and tied the horses, he watched her move through the small gathering, shaking hands, receiving nods, saying quiet words that meant something to the people she said them to. He watched Victor Hale arrive 10 minutes later. Hale came with 4 men, his lawyer Carver, and 3 associates, and he was dressed for a legal proceeding in a way that announced money without apology, and he carried himself with the careful poise of someone who has won enough times to be confident, but is not quite as confident as he wants to appear. He looked at the gathering of people outside the land office, and something behind his eyes shifted, some recalculation happening, and then he looked at Ethan, and the shift happened again. Carver was already inside when they entered, already arranging papers at the table on the right side of the room. He was a lean man, mid-50s, with the contained energy of someone who had spent 30 years treating courtrooms like chessboards and other people's lives like pieces on them. He glanced up when Clara came in. He looked at Collins and looked away. He looked at Ethan with a slightly longer assessment and then went back to his papers. Commissioner Aldridge was at the head of the room behind his desk, already in his official capacity. His glasses on a neutral expression on his face that Ethan read as a man determined to be fair and equally determined to appear so. He caught Ethan's eye for a fraction of a second and then looked at his papers. The hearing was called to order. Carver went first, as was customary for the party who had filed the claim. He was good. Ethan had expected that and was not surprised by it, but he watched the room while Carver spoke, watched Aldridge, watched the people who had come to observe and monitored how the words were landing. Carver's argument was elegant in its simplicity. The original 1873 water rights notation was made by a government surveyor operating outside his jurisdictional authority, rendering the notation legally void. Since the notation was void, there was no prior appropriation claim attached to the homestead filing, and therefore the water rights had never been formally established. Hale's claim, filed under the Territorial Water Act of 1882, was the first valid legal claim on the Northern Creek, and should be recognized accordingly. He said all of this in a measured, reasonable tone, as if he were explaining something obvious that everyone in the room had simply failed to notice before. "That's his whole case," Collins murmured beside Ethan. "And it's wrong from the second sentence." "I know," Ethan said quietly. "Let him finish." When Carver sat down, Aldridge looked at Clara's table. "Mrs. Whitfield, your response." Clara stood. She had her documents in front of her, and she spoke without notes which Ethan had not fully anticipated, and which clearly surprised Aldridge and Carver, both a woman in 1887 Montana, standing before a government commissioner and speaking from memory with the precision of a trained legal mind. She laid out the timeline first. The 1873 filing. The original survey certification. The continuous use from that date forward, documented in the ranch's own records and confirmed in the 1878 territorial drought audit. Then she said quietly and clearly, "I'd like to call my first witness." August. Riley walked to the front of the room like a man who had been waiting his whole life to say what he was about to say. He sat down. Aldridge administered the oath. And then Riley told the story of March 1873, in a voice that made it feel like yesterday, the cold of that spring, the 3 weeks of digging, the names of the men who'd worked beside him, the specific dimensions of the channel they'd built, and the government surveyor who had been present for the completion and had signed the documentation that same afternoon. Carver cross-examined him for 15 minutes, probing for inconsistencies in the memory, suggesting that a man remembering something from 14 years ago could not be relied upon for specific legal detail. Riley answered every question with the steady confidence of a man who was not confusing memory with imagination, and when Carver pushed hardest on the date, Riley reached into his coat pocket and produced a personal journal entry from March 16, 1873, 2 days after the filing, that described the completion of the irrigation channel and the presence of the government surveyor by name. The room shifted. Ethan felt it a collective intake of attention, the gathering of people who had been listening politely, suddenly leaning in. Carver sat down without further questions. "Your next witness, Mrs. Whitfield," Aldridge said. "Edmund Collins," Clara said. Collins stood. He moved with the deliberate pace of a man whose knees were speaking to him, but whose mind was entirely elsewhere, and he settled into the witness chair with an authority that came not from performance, but from the sheer accumulated weight of 40 years doing exactly this kind of work. He confirmed his credentials. He confirmed his authority under the Territorial Surveying Act of 1869, and here he produced the act itself, a worn copy with specific passages already marked, and read the relevant section aloud in a voice that required no assistance. He confirmed the 1873 filing and its water rights notation. He confirmed that the procedure he'd followed was standard documented and had been repeated across the territory without legal challenge in over 100 subsequent cases. Then he looked directly at Carver and said, "If the 1873 notation was procedurally invalid then, so are the water rights of every homestead filed in Montana Territory between 1869 and 1884. I'd be very interested to know whether Mr. Hale has examined his own title documents for the same defect." The room went absolutely still. Carver's composure held, but his pen stopped moving. Hale, sitting behind his lawyer, showed nothing on his face. But his right hand, resting on the table, closed slowly into a fist. Aldridge cleared his throat. "Mr. Collins, are you suggesting that Mr. Hale's own properties may contain the same notation you made for the Rose Creek Ranch filing?" "I'm suggesting," Collins said pleasantly, "that if Carver's legal theory is correct, it applies to every filing I was involved in during my tenure, which was 231 properties." He paused. "Including, as I recall, the original Broken Spur homestead filing in 1876. The room reacted. Not loudly, this was a legal proceeding, but the murmur that went through the observers was unmistakable. The sound of people doing arithmetic and arriving at a result that changed everything. Carver leaned toward Hale and said something in a voice too low to hear. Hale said something back. His face was very controlled now, the poise of a man who has spent a lifetime making sure his expressions don't cost him money. But something had cracked behind his eyes, some fundamental assumption about how this morning was going to go. Aldridge called a 15-minute recess. In the hallway, Clara found Ethan and stood close to him, her voice low. "He just destroyed his own case," she said. "Collins did," Ethan said. "That was his to destroy." "You knew he was going to do that." "I suspected," Ethan said. "Collins doesn't like men who use legal arguments they know are wrong. He has a particular way of dealing with them." She looked at him with something that was half relief and half the specific exhilaration that comes from a fight going right after a long time going wrong. "You rode 40 miles a day through mountain passes for a man who just made Victor Hale's lawyer look like a fool in front of the entire valley." "Among other reasons," Ethan said. She looked at him carefully. "Among other reasons," she repeated quietly. They held each other's gaze for a moment, the kind of moment that would have ended differently if they were not standing in a government hallway 15 minutes before a hearing resumed. Ethan looked away first, not because he wanted to, but because he wasn't ready to say the next thing in a hallway with 20 people within earshot. "When this is over," he said. She understood him immediately. "Yes," she said. "When this is over." They went back inside. Carver's redirect was clipped and cautious, a man walking on ice he'd just been told was thinner than he thought. He tried twice to re-establish the jurisdictional argument, and both times Collins answered him with specific statutory citations that left no room to maneuver. The third time Carver tried, Aldridge interrupted. "Mr. Carver," he said, "the Territorial Surveying Act of 1869 seems to me to be quite clear on this point. Unless you have evidence that the act itself was superseded between 1869 and 1873, which was the date of the filing in question, I'm having difficulty following the foundation of your jurisdictional challenge." Carver said, "Commissioner, it's our position that the Act's language regarding ancillary claims is subject to interpretation," Aldridge said. "Yes, you've argued that. But the document that Mr. Collins has presented is the Act itself with the relevant passage, and his reading of it seems consistent with the plain language." He paused. "Do you have a contradicting legal opinion? Case law, a ruling in another jurisdiction?" Silence. "No, Commissioner," Carver said. Ethan had spent enough time around Collins to know what was happening. Aldridge was a fair man who had just realized the case in front of him was considerably more one-sided than the filing had suggested, and he was being careful to make the record reflect that he'd given the losing side every opportunity to present their evidence before he ruled. He was clearing the ground for the ruling he'd already decided to make. Clara sat very still beside Ethan. He could feel the tension in her, not fear, not anymore, but the specific tightness of someone who can see the finish line and is not letting themselves believe it until they're across it. He understood that exactly. He felt it himself. Then Hale stood up. It surprised everyone in the room, including Carver, who put a hand on Hale's arm immediately. Hale removed the hand with a quiet deliberateness that made it clear the gesture was not welcome. "Commissioner Aldridge," Hale said. I'd like to address the hearing directly if I may. Aldridge looked at him for a moment. Mr. Hale, you're represented by counsel. It's unusual for— I understand that, Hale said. I'm asking for the courtesy of a few minutes. This is a matter that affects the whole valley. I think I have a right to speak to it. Aldridge considered. 3 minutes, he said. Hale came forward to stand before the commissioner's desk, and Ethan had to acknowledge, an impressive figure when he chose to use himself that way, large and composed, and carrying the particular gravity of a man who had built something real, even if he'd built it badly in places. He looked at Aldridge, and he did not look at Clara. I've spent 30 years building this valley, Hale said. I've employed men, improved land, created commerce that benefited every property in this territory. What I tried to do with Rose Creek Ranch— he paused. I believed I was being practical. I believed a woman alone could not manage a property this size and that it would fail, and the whole valley would suffer the effects. I was wrong about that. Another pause, and now he did look at Clara briefly, before looking back at Aldridge. I was wrong about several things. And it seems my attorney was wrong about the legal basis for this claim. He straightened. I'm withdrawing the filing, effective today. Mom. The room reacted with the sound of 20 people exhaling simultaneously. Carver sat very still, looking at the table. Clara sat very still, looking at nothing. Aldridge looked at Hale for a long moment. Mr. Hale, the withdrawal is noted. The filing is dismissed. He picked up his pen. For the record, I am also noting that the evidence presented today confirms Rose Creek Ranch's continuous and legally documented prior appropriation rights to the Northern Creek access in question. Should any future claim be made against those rights, this record will stand as controlling precedent. He signed the document in front of him. We're adjourned. Outside in the cold November air, the small crowd broke into the particular noise of a community that has just watched someone fight for something and win. People came to Clara, men who shook her hand with both of theirs, women who held her face, neighbors who had been watching from a distance for 2 years, and were now in this moment declaring which side of the line they'd always been on. Ethan stood slightly back and watched her receive it all with a grace that moved him in a way he was no longer going to pretend was purely professional. Collins came and stood beside him. You did good work on this, Collins said. We did good work, Ethan said. Don't be modest. You held that ranch together while she fought the legal battle, and you went and got me when she needed me. That's not incidental. Collins was watching Clara across the crowd. She's remarkable. Yes, Ethan said. She know how you feel. Ethan glanced at him. Collins. I'm old, Collins said. I've earned the right to ask direct questions. Ethan looked back at Clara. She was talking to Riley, her hand on the old man's arm, and she was smiling in a way he hadn't seen before, fully, completely, without the tension that had lived in her face since the morning he arrived. She knows some of it, he said. And the rest of it. I'm working on the words, Ethan said. Collins made a sound of mild impatience. Walker, you just rode 300 miles in 4 days. You're very good at the hard physical parts. I know. The conversation is easier, I promise you. Ethan looked at him sideways. When did you become a philosopher? I've always been a philosopher, Collins said comfortably. You just used to be too young to listen. He clapped Ethan on the shoulder with a hand that was still strong from 40 years of field work. Go talk to her. He walked away toward Riley, leaving Ethan alone at the edge of the crowd. Hale was still nearby, speaking quietly with Carver, or rather listening to Carver with the expression of a man receiving information he doesn't particularly want. As Ethan watched, Hale said something short and final, and Carver stopped talking, and Hale turned and walked toward his horse. He passed within 10 feet of Ethan. He stopped. Walker, he said. Hale. A silence that was not hostile exactly, but was not comfortable. Hale looked at him with the evaluating gaze he'd used that first morning at the ranch gate. You're not just a cowboy, he said. Most people aren't just what they first appear to be, Ethan said. Hale looked at him for another moment. Something moved through his expression that was close to resignation, though not quite close enough to be humbling. "She won't forgive me," he said. It wasn't a question. "That's not my answer to give," Ethan said. Hale nodded once. He walked to his horse and rode out of Cascade without looking back, and the crowd barely noticed him go. It was Miguel who found Ethan afterward, pulling him aside with the quiet urgency of a man delivering news he doesn't want to save. "Someone was at the ranch while we were gone," Miguel said. Ethan went still. "What?" "Danny wired me this morning. He stayed behind to watch the property." Miguel kept his voice low. "Reardon came back. Early this morning before dawn. Danny found him in the north pasture trying to cut the fence to the river access. The one we've been protecting. Is Danny all right?" He confronted him. Reardon ran, but Miguel paused. "He left something behind. A bag." Danny looked inside. He reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. This was in it. Ethan unfolded the paper. It was a document handwritten, not official, but formatted to look like a deed. A deed for the northern section of Rose Creek Ranch, including the creek access with Hale's name as the transferring party and Reardon's as the receiving party. Dated 3 days ago. Not a legal document, not even a competent forgery, but something that, in the right hands with a cooperative local official and a widow too exhausted to fight another legal battle, might have been used to create enough confusion to matter. "Hale didn't just want the water rights," Ethan said quietly. "No," Miguel agreed. "He wanted the land. The water was the first step." Ethan looked at the document in his hand. He thought about Clara standing 30 feet away in the crowd, her face finally clear of the tension that had lived in it for 2 years, talking to people who were telling her she'd won. He thought about telling her this. He thought about not telling her. He folded the paper. "Keep this," he said to Miguel. "Give it to Aldridge before we leave today. He needs to know what Hale intended. And Reardon needs to answer for the barn and the fence cutting the cattle. All of it. Document everything Danny saw this morning. Get it on paper while it's fresh." Ethan looked at him. "Do you think Hale knew about the fake deed?" Miguel thought about it carefully. "I think Reardon may have been operating on his own by the end. Hale withdrew the filing this morning. Maybe he decided to cut his losses." He paused. "Maybe Reardon didn't get the message in time. Or maybe Reardon decided to keep going with his own plan even after Hale stepped back," Ethan said. Either way, the intent had been there. The malice had been there. And the only thing standing between that and Clara losing her land had been a 19-year-old boy staying behind to watch the fence while everyone else rode to a hearing. Ethan walked back to Miguel's horse, pulled paper and pen from the saddlebag, and wrote a brief, clear account of the fake deed and Reardon's activities, signed it, and gave it to Miguel with instructions to put it directly in Aldridge's hand before they left the building. Then he went to find Clara. She was talking to a woman he didn't know, and she looked up when he approached with the new ease in her face that he was going to spend some time getting used to seeing. She excused herself and came to him. "What is it?" she said immediately. "Something that needs to be handled with Aldridge before we leave," he said. "Not an emergency, but today." He told her about Reardon and the fake deed quickly and clearly, giving her the facts without softening them. He watched her take it in the flash of anger, the quick calculation, the steadying. "He was going to come after the land directly," she said. "He may have been planning it from the beginning. The water rights filing was a pressure tactic. The real goal was always the land itself." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that surprised him. "I feel sorry for Frank Reardon," she said. He looked at her. "He spent 7 years building something he believed he had a share in," she said. "Thomas didn't see it that way, and maybe Thomas was right, but Reardon has been carrying that wound for 10 years. And instead of building something of his own, he spent all of it helping a man like Hale tear down what Thomas built." She shook her head slightly. "That's a terrible way to live. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. It was such a specifically Clara thing to say, not naive, not sentimental, but genuinely thoughtful about the interior lives of people who had tried to hurt her. "You're a very unusual woman," he said. She looked at him with a directness that had no armor in it. "You say that like it surprised you." "It surprised me," he admitted. "When I rode in from the south 2 months ago, and you met me on the porch and told me you didn't have time to babysit grown men, I thought you were impressive. I thought you were strong." He paused. "I didn't know yet that you were kind." She was very still. "Kindness isn't weakness," she said softly. Thomas always said that. He said the meanest men he'd ever met were the ones who thought being hard was the same as being strong. Thomas was right, Ethan said. He was right about a lot of things, she said, and then quietly, he would have liked you. The weight of that landed in exactly the place it was meant to, and Ethan didn't try to deflect it. He held it. "I hope so," he said. She looked at him for a long moment in the November cold, with the sound of the crowd diminishing around them, and the sky pressing down in that gray close way it had before snow. "Ethan," she said. "I know," he said. "I haven't said it yet." "I know what you're going to say." She looked at him with the small specific smile she had that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite frustration, but was somewhere perfectly balanced between the two. "You can't know. I haven't decided exactly how to say it." "Take your time," he said. "I've been taking my time for 2 months, she said. And she looked at him. "And I think that you came to this ranch 6 years after you lost your own, and you spent 2 months acting like a man who was planning to leave while doing everything a man does when he's decided to stay. And I don't know if you know which one is true yet, but I know which one I'm hoping for." She paused. "I think you belong here, Ethan. I think you have since about the 3rd week, and I think you know it." He looked at her for a long time. "The ranch is saved," he said. "Yes." "You don't need me here for the reason you hired me." "No," she said. "I don't." "Then the question is whether there's a different reason." She held his gaze without wavering. "Is there?" He thought about 6 years of not staying. He thought about what Collins had said in Helena, and what the wire had said, and what his own chest had felt like, riding through mountain passes at night with the weight of this particular outcome on his shoulders, a weight he'd never carried for anything temporary in his life, only for things he cared about. He thought about standing in a dark barn the night he arrived and feeling something he couldn't name. He could name it now. "Yes," he said. "There is." She let out a breath, very quiet, very controlled, but he heard it. "Then say it," she said. "Stop being a careful man for 30 seconds and just say it." He looked at her. This woman who had fought 2 years alone, and one who had read legal statutes by lamplight, and moved her documents before dawn, and directed a fire response with shaking hands, and stood in front of a government commissioner without notes, and remembered every word, and he said it. "I love this ranch," he said. "I love what's been built here. I love the land and the work and the way it matters." He paused. "And I love the woman who refused to let anyone take it from her." Another pause. "I've been in love with you since approximately the 3rd week, Clara. You're right about that." She looked at him for one full long moment. Then she laughed. Not the small controlled almost laughs he'd seen before. A real laugh, sudden and warm and human, the laugh of someone who has been waiting for the punchline of a long joke and is relieved it's finally here. "Approximately the 3rd week," she repeated. "I was trying to be precise." "You're a very precise man," she said, and her voice was soft now under the laughter, the warmth fully in it. "Clara." "Yes." "I'm not packing my bag," he said. "Not this time." She looked at him and all the laughter went quiet, and what was left was something cleaner and steadier and more permanent, the expression of a woman who has decided something she is not going to undecide. "Good," she said. "Because I am not letting you." He reached out and took her hand. She let him. They stood like that in the cold Cascade Street while the last of the crowd moved around them. Two people who had arrived at the same place by completely different roads, holding on to each other in the particular way of people who understand what it costs to get there. Miguel saw them from across the street and had the wisdom to go find Collins immediately and engage him in a conversation about surveying methodology that lasted until they were all ready to ride home. Collins, who had seen Ethan Walker ride 300 miles in 4 days for a woman he claimed he was just working for, did not require much convincing to be elsewhere. They rode home in the early afternoon. The 5 of them spread across the road with the ranch, waiting at the other end of it, the main house, and the north barn, and the ruins of the south barn that had yet to be rebuilt, and the cattle in the pasture, and the creek running clean and free through the northern section where no one was ever going to claim it again. August Riley rode on Ethan's left, and he talked the whole way home about nothing consequential. The weather, his garden, a horse he'd once owned that could find its way back to any barn it had ever been in, no matter the distance or the dark. Collins rode on Clara's right, and they talked about Thomas, about the early years, about things Collins remembered from the survey work in the valley that Clara had never heard before, small true stories that made her laugh and made her quiet in equal measure. Ethan listened to all of it and said very little. He rode beside Clara, and the space between them on the road was the same space it had always been physically, but it was completely different in every way that mattered. At some point, without discussion, their horses drifted close enough that their knees were nearly touching. Neither of them moved away. An hour from the ranch, Clara said quietly, so only he could hear, "What do we tell people about what he said?" She gave him a look. "About the case," he said innocently. "Ethan, tell them whatever is true," he said. "That's always worked well enough so far." She looked at him with the balanced expression, amusement, exasperation, warmth. "You are the most careful man I have ever met." "I prefer thorough," he said. "I'm sure you do." He looked at her sideways. "What do you want to tell people, Clara?" She looked ahead at the road, at the land opening up around them, at the long reach of the valley that was hers and intended to stay hers. "I want to tell them," she said slowly, "that the ranch is saved, that the water rights are confirmed, that the man who came to work for me in September is—" She paused. "Staying." "That's all true?" he said. "Yes," she said. "It is. It—" They rode the last hour home in the quiet that had become their most natural language together, the one they'd spoken since approximately the 3rd week. The silence that was full of everything they were still learning how to say. Danny met them at the date, his young face so relieved to see Ethan's face that he nearly forgot to be casual about it. He got the horses. He reported that everything was in order. He did not mention the morning's events beyond what was necessary because Ethan had already told him what to document, and he'd documented it. Ethan walked through the gate onto Rose Creek Ranch and stopped for a moment. He'd walked through a lot of gates in 6 years. He'd always walked through them knowing he would eventually walk back out. He stood at this one and felt the difference between all those gates and this one, and it was not small. Clara came to stand beside him. "Welcome home," she said quietly. He looked at her. He looked at the land that stretched away from them in every direction, the land Thomas Whitfield had built and Clara Whitfield had refused to surrender, and that would now continue to be what it had always been, a place someone had cared for enough to fight for. "Thank you," he said. She took his arm. They walked in. The south barn went up in 3 weeks. Not because they had the money to do it quickly, they didn't, not comfortably, but because 11 men showed up on the first Monday morning after the hearing, without being asked, riding in from neighboring properties with tools and lumber, and the particular purposeful energy of a community that has decided collectively to make something right. Clara came out onto the porch at 6 in the morning and found Miguel already directing the unloading of timber from a wagon she'd never seen before, and behind it 2 more wagons, and behind those a string of horses tied to the fence with their owners, already sorting materials and arguing pleasantly about the best way to set the foundation posts. She stood on the porch and didn't say anything for a long moment. Ethan came up behind her with 2 cups of coffee and handed her one and stood beside her and watched the yard filling up with people who had made a decision about where they stood. "Did you arrange this?" she said. "No," he said. She looked at him sideways. "Miguel may have sent a few words around," he admitted, "but the coming was their own idea." She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and looked at the growing crowd in her yard, men she'd known for years, and men she barely knew, and a few she'd only seen at the hearing 3 days ago. All of them here, all of them working. She pressed her lips together for a moment. "I don't know what to do with this," she said quietly. "You don't have to do anything with it," Ethan said. "Just let them." She looked at him. "When did you become wise?" "I've always been wise," he said. "You've just been too busy to notice." She laughed, the real laugh, the one he'd heard for the first time outside the land office in Cascade, and intended to spend a considerable amount of his future life finding reasons to hear again. She went inside and started cooking, and by noon she had fed every man on the property twice, and the south barn's frame was standing. Danny worked harder than anyone. He'd been quieter since the morning of the hearing, the morning he'd confronted Reardon alone in the north pasture before dawn, and Ethan had given him space to be quiet, understanding that sometimes a person needed to sit inside something they'd done right before they could talk about it comfortably. On the 3rd day of the rebuild, when the walls were going up and the work had settled into a rhythm, Ethan found Danny working alone on the far side of the structure and came to work beside him. They worked in silence for a while. Then Danny said without looking up, "I should have told you about Reardon sooner. When I first figured it out." "Yes," Ethan said. "I was scared of what it would mean, that I'd made it worse." "You were scared," Ethan said. "That's different from being dishonest. What matters is what you did when you had to decide fast and alone." He kept working. "You made the right call that morning." Danny was quiet for a moment. "He was bigger than me. Reardon. I know. I didn't have a weapon. I know that too. I just walked up to him and told him to get off the land," Danny said. He said it like he was still slightly surprised by himself. "My heart was going about 200 miles an hour, but I couldn't let him do it. Not after everything." Ethan looked at him. "That's what it means to belong somewhere," he said. "When you'll walk up to something bigger than you because you can't make yourself walk the other way." Danny absorbed that. Then he picked up his hammer and went back to work, and the set of his shoulders was different after that. Not looser exactly, but more settled, like something had found the place it was supposed to sit. The formal complaint against Frank Reardon was filed with the county sheriff 5 days after the hearing. Aldridge had added his own notation to the record, confirming that the fraudulent deed found in Reardon's bag constituted an attempt to defraud a property owner following a legal proceeding which carried its own weight under territorial law. The sheriff rode out to Rose Creek Ranch to take statements from Danny and Miguel and Ethan, and Clara gave hers, last clear factual, without embellishment, the same directness she brought to everything. When the sheriff asked if she wanted to press the maximum charges available, she paused for just a moment. "I want him to answer for what he did," she said. "The barn, the fence cutting, the cattle, the fake deed, all of it. But I don't want to spend years in court over Frank Reardon." She paused. "What's fair is enough." The sheriff looked at her with the expression of a man who has seen a lot of people in a lot of property disputes and is not accustomed to this particular answer. "Most people want more than fair," he said. "Most people are still angry," Clara said. "I'm past angry." Ethan, sitting across the room, looked at her and thought about what it had cost her to get past angry, 2 years of fighting and losing and rebuilding and fighting again, and thought that most people never got there and wouldn't have blamed her if she hadn't. The fact that she had was not softness. It was something harder and rarer. Reardon, when found, didn't fight the charges. He was tired, the sheriff reported, tired and broke and without Hale's backing anymore. A bitter man who had spent 10 years nursing a grievance and was now sitting with the full weight of what that grievance had cost him and everyone around him. He pled to a reduced set of charges and was sentenced to 6 months of labor and ordered out of the territory afterward. Clara received this news in the kitchen, read the letter twice, set it down, and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "I hope he finds something worth building." Ethan looked at her over his coffee cup. "I mean it," she said. "I know you do," he said. "That's what I was thinking." She looked at him across the table. It was a Thursday morning in early December, the cold fully settled in the rebuilt south barn, standing solid and new in the yard outside the cattle. In their winter rotation, the ranch running the way it was supposed to run. She looked at him the way she'd been looking at him since Cascade, with the openness of someone who has stopped maintaining the careful distance and found the space without it more comfortable than she'd expected. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask." "What are you planning to do in the spring?" He set down his cup. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she turned the coffee cup in her hands. "You came here for a season's work. The season ended. The legal situation is resolved. You could go anywhere, find work somewhere else. You could go back to survey work if Collins would have you. You could—" She stopped. "I'm asking badly. Let me try again." "Take your time," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Are you staying, Clara? I know what you said in Cascade. I know what you told me at the gate. I just need to hear—" She paused. Some things need to be said more than once. He understood that. He understood it completely from a woman who had spent 2 years hearing silence where words used to be. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. "I'm staying," he said. "I'm not leaving in the spring. I'm not leaving next fall. I'm not packing my bag the next time something gets hard or the next time I get afraid of what I'm building here." He paused. "I'm staying, Clara. All the way." She looked at his hand on hers. She turned her hand over and held his. "All right," she said quietly. "Good." They sat like that for a while in the warm kitchen with the winter outside the windows, and it was as simple and as enormous as anything Ethan Walker had ever done in his life. Collins stayed through December. He said it was because his knees didn't travel well in winter weather, which was partially true, and because Aldridge had asked him to remain available in case Carver filed any further motions, which was also partially true. The real reason, which he did not state, but which everyone on the ranch understood, was that he was 70 years old and had spent 40 of them traveling, and he had found in the kitchen of Rose Creek Ranch a table where people talked about real things and ate good food and laughed without effort, and he was in no hurry to leave it. He and Clara developed a particular friendship that Ethan watched with a specific warmth he hadn't anticipated. Collins knew things about the valley's history that Clara had never heard, stories from the survey years, accounts of the original homesteaders. Small true details about Thomas's early dealings that Aldridge had mentioned to Collins years ago in passing. He gave her these stories the way a person gives someone something they didn't know they were missing, and she received them the way she received everything, with full attention, with questions that showed she'd heard every word. One evening near Christmas, Collins and Clara were at the kitchen table with survey maps spread between them. She had asked him to help her understand the full extent of Rose Creek Ranch's documented boundaries, every line and marker and recorded limit, and Ethan sat near the fire and listened to the two of them work. Collins explaining, Clara asking. The specific pleasure of two people who were both genuinely interested in the same thing, finding the edges of what they knew, and then going past them together. At some point, Clara said, "There's a section here in the northeast corner that's never been formally incorporated into the main ranch documentation. Thomas always meant to file the extension claim, but he kept saying he'd do it next season." Collins looked at the map. "That's common. People build faster than the paperwork follows." He studied the area she was pointing to. "How long have you been running cattle on it?" "Since 1880, she said. Collins looked up at her. "Uninterrupted. Every season." Collins smiled slowly. "Then file it," he said. "You've got a prior use claim on it that's as solid as the creek. File it with Aldridge in the new year, and it becomes part of the official record." Clara looked at the map for a moment, at the section that had been on the edge of her land for 7 years, without being formally hers. "I should have done this when Thomas died," she said. "You were doing about 15 other things when Thomas died," Ethan said from his chair. She looked at him. "You're very good at appearing not to be listening." "I wasn't appearing," he said. "I was genuinely listening." Collins made a sound that was not quite laughter. He reached over and tapped the map section. "File it, Clara. First week of January. Ethan can go with you." "I don't need someone to go with me," she said. "No," Collins agreed. "But he'll want to." He glanced at Ethan with the equanimity of an old man who had nothing to lose by being accurate. "Won't you?" "Yes," Ethan said. Clara looked at both of them and made a specific sound that expressed several things at once, including the fact that she was not going to win this particular argument and had largely decided she didn't want to. "Fine," she said. "First week of January." Tiens, the proposal was not what either of them would have predicted, which was appropriate, given that nothing about how they'd arrived at this point had been predictable. It was a Tuesday morning in the last week of December, a clear, cold day, with the ground frozen hard and the cattle settled, and nothing requiring immediate attention for the first time in weeks. Ethan saddled 2 horses without telling Clara why, and knocked on the kitchen door and said, "Come ride with me." She looked at him from the doorway. "Where?" "I want to show you something." She studied him for a moment with the evaluating look she still used when she was deciding how much to trust a statement before she had more information. Then she got her coat. They rode north past the repaired fence lines and the winter pasture and the section of creek where the water rights had nearly been taken, and then further north to a section of the ranch Ethan had found. In his first weeks, a high piece of ground that looked out over the full extent of Rose Creek Ranch in every direction, the whole great reach of it visible from a single point. He'd come here once early on to understand the scope of what he was working on. He hadn't told anyone about it. Clara pulled up beside him and looked out and was quiet for a long time. "You can see all of it from here," she said. "Yes." "I didn't know this was here." "Thomas might not have known either. It's not obvious from the lower ground." She looked out over the ranch, the buildings, the pastures, the line of the northern creek, the new south barn standing solid in the distance. Her ranch, her land, all of it intact. "It's extraordinary," she said softly. "Yes," he said. "It is." She looked at him. He was already looking at her, and he'd been looking at her the whole time she was looking at the land, and she knew that, and neither of them needed to say anything about it. "Ethan," she said. "I have something to say," he said. "You're using your careful voice." "This requires some care," he said. She stopped talking and waited with the full patient attention she gave to things that mattered. He looked at her. "I came to this ranch 6 years after I stopped building anything. I told myself I was being practical, that a man who's lost everything once builds smaller the second time, or doesn't build at all. I told myself that was wisdom." He paused. "It wasn't. It was fear wearing the coat of wisdom, which is a very convincing disguise." She held his gaze without moving. "You showed me the difference," he said. "Not by telling me, just by being what you are. A person who lost everything and chose to keep building. Not because it was easy. Not because there was no risk. But because the alternative was to let what you loved be taken, and you couldn't do that." He paused. "I've been thinking about that since approximately the 3rd week." "You and your 3rd week," she said softly. "I want to stay here," he said. "I want to help build this ranch into what Thomas envisioned and what you fought for. I want to file the northeast section in January and rebuild the south fence in spring and expand the cattle operation the way your records suggest it can grow. I want to do all of that." He stopped. "And I want to do it as your husband, if you'll have me." Silence. The kind of silence that isn't empty, that is so full it takes a moment to move through. Clara looked at him for a long time. The wind moved across the high ground, and the cold was sharp and clear, and the whole ranch stretched away below them in every direction waiting. Thomas used to say, she said slowly, that the best decisions he ever made were the ones that scared him the most at the time. That sounds right, Ethan said. I want to tell you something, she said, and I want you to hear it the right way. Tell me. Thomas was the love of my life, she said. He was my partner and my friend, and the person who helped me become who I am. I will love him until I die. That is true, and it is going to stay true, and I need you to understand that before anything else. I understand it, Ethan said, and I also, she stopped. I also know that a person's heart is not a fixed size. I know that loving again is not replacing. I know that Thomas would have liked you and would have told me so in that direct way he had, and that he would have wanted me to stop carrying this alone. She looked at Ethan with everything fully present in her face, the 2 years of loss, and the 2 months of rebuilding, and the morning in Cascade, and every conversation they'd had in the barn and the kitchen, and the cold rides between properties, all of it together. I love you, Ethan Walker. I have for a while, and yes, I will have you. He let out a breath he hadn't known he'd been holding. Yes, he said. Yes, she said. Stop being precise and come here. He reached across the space between their horses, and she took his hand, and they sat like that on the high ground above Rose Creek Ranch on a frozen December morning, holding on to each other in the particular way of people who have both lost enough to understand exactly what they have. They married in February, on a day that started cold and then cleared to a rare winter blue that felt like the world offering its opinion on the occasion. Collins was there. He had gone back to Helena in January and come back for the wedding with the stated reason of wanting to verify that the Northeast section filing had been done correctly, which it had, and the real reason of not missing the thing he'd seen coming since the night in Cascade and was not going to sit in Helena alone and let pass without witnessing. He sat in the front row of the small gathering in the Rose Creek Ranch main house, with the satisfaction of a man who has been right about something important. Riley was there dressed again in his best coat, sitting beside Collins with the quiet emotion of an old man attending the continuation of a story he'd had a small part in starting 40 years ago, when he helped dig an irrigation channel in cold March mud. Miguel stood beside Ethan, because there was no more natural place for him to stand, and because the past 3 months had made explicit what had been true for longer, that they were not employer and employee, but something closer to the way a ranch family actually works, built on reliability and mutual respect, and the knowledge that when things went wrong, the other person was going to be there. Danny stood with Miguel, still 19, already a different 19 than the one who had ridden into town with a message he didn't understand. He would be 20 in March. He had asked Ethan the week before, with the careful casualness of someone trying not to appear as serious as they were, whether Ethan thought there was a future for him at Rose Creek Ranch long term. Ethan had looked at him for a moment and said, I think the question is whether you want one. And Danny had said that he did. And Ethan had said, then you have one. Clara wore a dress that had been her mother's, altered to fit her simpler than what was fashionable and exactly right. She did not look like a woman performing the occasion. She looked like herself, which was better than any performance could have been. The words were said, simple and direct, the way both of them preferred things. Ethan Walker and Clara Whitfield made their promises to each other in front of the people who had earned the right to hear them, and the house was warm, and the winter was outside, and for a single hour, the world was exactly the right size. Afterward, while people ate, and Collins held court about the territorial surveying laws of the 1860s to an audience of 3 who were more interested than might have been expected, Clara found Ethan standing near the window and came to stand beside him. How do you feel? She asked. He considered the question seriously, which was the only way he considered questions. Like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, he said. She leaned against him slightly. Good, because you're not going anywhere. No, he said. I'm not. Spring came in hard and fast that year, the way Montana springs did, and with it, the work that never ended and never was supposed to. The northeast section was formally filed and incorporated into the Rose Creek Ranch documentation. The south fence was rebuilt properly with new posts and wire the way Ethan had rebuilt the north fence in his first weeks, intended to last, not intended to do. The cattle herd expanded by 32 head, purchased through a contract Clara had negotiated over the winter with a breeder in Billings that Ethan suspected she could have gotten earlier, but had been waiting for leverage she now had. She hadn't needed his help negotiating it. He hadn't offered. That was one of the things he had understood early and confirmed slowly, that Clara Whitfield did not need anyone to do things for her. What she had needed, and what he could offer, was someone to do things beside her, and there was a difference between those two things that mattered enormously to both of them. Victor Hale's name came up occasionally through the spring, in the way that a large presence leaves an echo even after it's gone. He had sold 2 of his smaller properties in March at prices that suggested urgency rather than choice. The story that circulated, and Miguel reported it with the neutral tone he used for information he'd gathered and wasn't sure what to do with, was that Collins's comment at the hearing about the Broken Spur's own title documents had prompted Hale's lawyer to do a thorough review, and the review had found 2 other filings that carried the same legal question Carver had been trying to use against Clara. The irony being that the argument Hale had paid Carver to make had created a problem for Hale's own properties that hadn't existed before the filing. Clara heard this and was quiet for a moment. "Does that satisfy you?" Ethan asked. She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "Not really. I didn't need him to lose. I just needed him to stop." She paused. He stopped. "That's enough." She went back to her ledgers. Ethan watched her bent over her work, and thought about all the things he'd believed about the kind of person who survived what she'd survived. He'd thought survival made people hard. He'd thought it made them smaller, more careful with what they gave, less willing to risk what they'd rebuilt. He'd believed that because it was what had happened to him. Clara had survived and gone the other direction. She was more open than she'd been before, not less. More willing to trust, not less. She had taken everything that had been thrown at her and refused to let it make her into something meaner. And every day he watched her do that with the consistent, quiet determination of someone who has decided who she is and is not going to let circumstance revise the answer. He thought about that a lot, and he thought about what it meant for him, that the person who had shown him he'd been wrong about staying had also shown him without intending to, that he'd been wrong about what loss did to a person. That it was a choice finally. What you let it make you. He'd made one choice for 6 years. He'd made a different one in September, when he rode south from Billings and turned onto the road to Rose Creek Ranch. He didn't know yet exactly when the second choice had happened, whether it was the porch, the barn, the lamplight, legal discussion, the ride to Cascade, or some earlier moment he hadn't recognized at the time. He suspected it had been gradual, the way real changes usually were, accumulating in small increments until the weight of them tipped the balance all at once. But he knew when he'd understood it. He knew exactly. It was a cold Montana night riding back from nowhere when he'd smelled smoke from a mile out and felt fear. Not the careful, manageable fear of a man protecting temporary employment, but the desperate, specific fear of a man who has something he cannot afford to lose. That was when he'd known. On a warm evening in early June, Ethan was mending a post in the east pasture, the same east pasture where Danny had spotted the broken spur horse 9 months ago, the same fence line Ethan had walked on his first real day of work when he heard horses and looked up to see 2 riders coming from the North Ridge. He didn't recognize them until they were close. Then he recognized the older one and straightened. The man was maybe 60, weathered and spare, with a careful way of sitting his horse that spoke of a lifetime in the saddle. He pulled up at the fence line and looked at Ethan with the evaluating gaze of someone who has decided before getting off his horse whether the conversation is worth having. "Ethan Walker," he said. "Yes, I'm Samuel Garrett. I run the Bar G outfit up past the North Ridge. Heard about what happened here this past fall." He paused. "Heard you're the man who put the legal case together." "Clara Whitfield put the case together," Ethan said. I helped. Garrett looked at him steadily. I've got a situation with a water rights dispute of my own. Different circumstances, but similar shape. My neighbor filed against me in February, and the hearing is in August. He paused. I'd like to talk to you about it, if you have time. Ethan looked at him. He looked at the fence post in his hands. He thought about what Collins had said in Helena about the survey work he'd given up too early. He thought about the legal texts Clara still read by lamplight some evenings, adding to what she knew, because she believed knowing things had value, regardless of whether you needed them right now. He thought about a man who had spent 6 years being careful about what he built, and had walked onto one specific piece of ground and found without intending to exactly the life he'd been avoiding and exactly the person he'd needed to find. I have time, Ethan said. Come up to the house. My wife will want to be part of this conversation. Garrett nodded. He looked around at the east pasture, at the land running away in every direction, at the rebuilt south barn, visible in the distance, at the evidence everywhere of a property that was not declining, but growing. Nice ranch, Garrett said. Yes, Ethan said. It is. He set down his tools and got his horse and rode with Garrett back toward the main house, and the summer land stretched wide and green around them, and somewhere ahead, Clara was in the kitchen, or the study, or the yard. And the house was lit, and the smoke from the chimney was drifting straight up in the still June air, and every foot of ground between the east pasture fence and that front door was land Ethan Walker knew by heart. He'd learned it the way you learn something you intend to keep. He'd learned it like a man who was home. Years later, when people in the Judith River Valley talked about Rose Creek Ranch, and they did, because it had become the kind of place people pointed to when they needed an example of something that lasted, they would say it was Clara Whitfield's determination that had saved it. And that was true, and she deserved every word of it. But the people who had been there, who had watched it happen from the inside, knew it was something more specific than determination alone. It was the particular thing that happened when two people who had both lost enough to know exactly what things were worth decided to stop being careful and build something that was meant to be permanent. Clara ran the business with an intelligence that grew sharper every year. The ranch expanded twice in the decade after the hearing, incorporating neighboring properties, when their owners sold willingly and turning them into something continuous with what was already there. She developed a reputation in the territory that had nothing to do with being a widow who had managed to hold on. She became known simply as the best cattle operator in the Judith River Valley, which was a thing said without qualifier, without the footnote of gender, because the results made the qualifier irrelevant. Ethan built the legal practice he'd found by accident, not formally, not as a lawyer, but as the man you sent for when you had a land or water dispute and wanted someone who knew the statutes and the terrain and how those two things intersected, and who would work with the same focused attention, whether the property in question was 1,000 acres or 160. He rode a lot of miles on behalf of people who couldn't afford a Bozeman attorney and needed someone who understood the specific cruelties that land law could be made to perform. He didn't charge what he could have charged because that had never been the point. Collins came back every winter for 6 years, until his knees finally made the trip impossible. And then Clara and Ethan went to him instead, spending a week in Helena each January, going through old survey records and finding properties whose legal situations needed the same kind of attention Rose Creek Ranch had needed. It became something they did together. Clara with her head for numbers and contracts. Ethan with his knowledge of the law and the land, both of them with the hard-earned understanding of what it meant to have something worth protecting and almost lose it. August. Riley came to dinner on the second Sunday of every month until he was too old to ride, and then Danny drove the wagon to bring him, and he sat at the head of the table that was nominally Clara's, but was genuinely everyone's, and told stories about the valley in the early years that nobody else remembered, and that Clara wrote down carefully in a separate ledger she kept for exactly that purpose. Miguel stayed. He was always going to stay. He built himself a small house on the south edge of the property in the second year, and Clara signed it over to him free and clear, and he protested, and she told him not to be foolish, and he stopped protesting. He married a woman from Cascade named Esperanza, who had a laugh that could be heard from the north pasture, and who managed the household with an efficiency that made Clara's already considerable organization look casual by comparison. They had 2 children. The children grew up knowing the ranch the way children who grow up on land know it in their bodies, in their instincts, in the specific gravity that a particular piece of ground exerts on a person who was shaped by it. Danny stayed too. He grew into the kind of man who did not need to be told what to do because he already knew. And eventually, Ethan gave him the fence management and the cattle rotation and the care of the younger hands. And he did all of it with the steady reliability of someone who understood at 19, in a cold north pasture before dawn, what it meant to stand between what you belonged to and what wanted to take it. And Clara and Ethan. They built what they had said they would build, and they did it in the way that things get built when the people building them have both failed enough to know what matters and succeeded enough to know how to make it last. They disagreed sometimes with the directness of two people who respected each other enough not to pretend and worked through the disagreements to the other side. They worked beside each other through drought years and good years, through the slow changes that came to the territory in the 1890s and the faster changes after that, through the ordinary large and small dramas of a life shared completely. Some mornings, Ethan would come in from the early work and find Clara at the kitchen table with her ledgers and her coffee, exactly as she'd been the morning he'd first come through that door, with news about a fence cut in the dark. And he would stop for a moment and look at her and feel the full weight of what he'd almost ridden away from. He never told her about those moments. Some things were not for words. But one evening, in late autumn years, into their life together, she came out to find him sitting on the porch in the cooling air, looking out over the land the way he sometimes did at the end of the day, not thinking about anything specific, just looking. She brought him coffee and sat down beside him, and for a while they were quiet together in the way that required no management, the quiet of two people who have learned each other's silences the way they've learned each other's voices. "What are you thinking about?" she said. "I was thinking about the morning I rode in," he said. "What I expected." "What did you expect?" "Nothing," he said. "That's the honest answer. I expected nothing. I'd stopped expecting things." She looked at him. And now, he thought about the question. He thought about the east pasture and the kitchen table, and the lamplight, and the 300 miles in 4 days, and the hand he'd reached across the space between two horses, and what it had felt like to walk through the gate at the end of that long ride. And no, he was not going to walk back out. He thought about a woman who had said to him on the worst morning of a very bad week that a person could survive without a home, but could not truly live without somewhere they belonged, and who had been talking about herself and had accidentally been talking about him. "Now," he said, "I expect mornings." She looked at him. "I expect to wake up and know where I am," he said. "I expect the work and the trouble and the good days and the hard days." He looked at her steadily. "I expect you." She put her hand in his. "That's everything," she said. "Yes," he said, "it is." The land stretched away from them in every direction, the land they had fought for and won, and were still winning every day in the ways that mattered, through care, through presence, through the stubborn daily choice to build something that was meant to outlast the building of it. The cattle were in for the night. The barn was warm. The hands had gone to their rest. Rose Creek Ranch held itself together in the dark, as it always had, as it always would not, because the land was easy, or the work was finished, or the trouble was done, but because the people inside it had decided each in their own time, and for their own reasons, that this was where they belonged. And belonging, once you stopped running from it, turned out to be the most permanent thing in the world.